Kenny there. Committee will order, and I've called this hearing of the full Committee on Judiciary to examine the events surrounding the standoff between federal law enforcement agencies and members of the Branch Davidian cult near Waco, Texas. As the members well know, hearings at the full committee level are rare enough an occurrence to be called extraordinary, and I believe that the subject matter of today's hearing is appropriate for such extraordinary treatment because it cuts across multiple aspects of the committee's broad jurisdiction over law enforcement activities. While speculative and contradictory theories have abounded, it is only in the past few days that on-site forensic teams have begun to draw a number of tentative conclusions based on scientific observation and testing. That's all for the best, even if it departs from the scripts of the made-for-television movies already in production. The basic chronology of events related to the standoff and its fiery conclusion can be stated succinctly. On February 28th, after an extensive investigation and pursuant to legal process, a team of agents from the Treasury Department's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms raided the heavily armed compound, then under control of cult leader calling himself David Koresh, in order to serve warrants for federal weapons violations. The raid turned into a fierce gun battle that left 4 BATF agents dead, 15 wounded, and 6 cult members dead. There ensued a standoff for the next 51 days, during which time the Federal Bureau of Investigation assumed the lead law enforcement responsibility and attempted through a variety of tactics to persuade Koresh to lay down his weapons, let the adult and juvenile cult members leave the compound, all to no avail. Finally, on April the 19th, the FBI undertook a major action to inject tear gas into the compound in an effort to drive the occupants out. The effort failed. Instead, Koresh and more than 80 of his followers died as a raging fire consumed all the compound's buildings in a few short minutes. However, establishing the baseline chronology of events is not the sole purpose for what for being here today. Rather, it is to hear from the 3 law enforcement officials directly responsible for the actions and the choices taken in Waco so that we can understand the decision-making process behind the events. Now, I don't relish playing omniscient second-guesser when there are still facts to be ascertained, evidence to be adduced. And given the instant experts that pop up everywhere in the press, I may be in a distinct minority. What I care about is whether we have a place in our federal enforcement agencies the capability and, yes, the creativity to deal with the increasingly disturbing situation of terrorism, whether in the high office towers of our urban centers or in small entrenched pockets of alienated citizens who operate separate and apart from a larger society. If such groups, whether they're called cults or not, pose a direct physical and violent threat to their own members or to others in society, then their operations cannot be ignored or justified through invocations to the great American tradition of the right of each citizen to be left alone. Oliver Wendell Holmes declared, "The essence of a free society is indeed the right to be let alone, but not at the expense of the social compact which allows all of us as Americans to live together based on the values we share together." What this committee and the public need to know is how, in a difficult situation of dealing with Branch Davidian cult, did our agencies perform, and how they processed signals, other information, such as it was from this man Koresh, whether they developed alternative plans of action, how they negotiated, how they prepared, how they implemented, decisions that were made. The verdict on David Koresh methods and aims can already be read in the Gallup polls. We're here to seek answers to weightier questions. I'm delighted our three leading law enforcement officials have made themselves available to the committee. And now I would just like to offer several notes of caution about testimony we're going to hear today. First, the investigations of both the decision-making process and the events of last Monday are at a very preliminary stage. It may well be that the answers to many of our questions will have to wait until completion of the forensic examination or the internal review of the Treasury and Justice Department activities that the President has ordered. And secondly, it may be that the witnesses will be reluctant to respond to some questions because they might expose investigative sources and methods or could jeopardize the pending criminal actions against a number of cult members relating to the deaths of 4 BATF agents. I believe that people of goodwill can easily accommodate both these considerations and Congress's need for accurate and complete information. We're participating in an important proceeding today, and to permit all members to have the chance to question our witnesses, I feel compelled to limit oral opening statements to the ranking minority members of the full committee and the chairman and the ranking minority members of the 2 subcommittees with major jurisdictions over the issues under discussion. Of course, all members are free and encouraged to submit individual statements for the record at this point. And so at this point, I would yield to my distinguished friend from New York, Mr. Ham Fish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is indeed a tragic set of circumstances that brings us here today. In recent days, there have been considerable fault-finding and finger-pointing. Hopefully, as you have said, this hearing will get us beyond recrimination and help us to better understand what happened in Waco, why it happened, and how better to prepare for possible future similar episodes. On Monday, April the 19th, 86 persons, 24 of whom were children, lost their lives. Prior to this, on February 28th, 4 brave ATF agents were killed in the line of duty. This committee oversees the operations of the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. It is a legitimate exercise of our legislative and oversight responsibilities to inquire into the strategies and decisions that led to the tragic events in Waco. Moreover, the American people expect their Congress to inquire on their behalf, deliberately, thoroughly, and fairly, into the threat, the decision-making, the options, and the lessons learned. Obviously, this was an unusual and extremely difficult situation for law enforcement officials because they were dealing with a complex, unpredictable, and dangerous personality. This certainly was not the classic hostage situation, nor was it terrorism. But was this a bizarre, isolated incident or a portent of things to come? We need to know whether we are facing a new and different challenge to the public safety, health, and welfare. Law enforcement in this country today involves enormous challenges. It places great responsibility on the shoulders of law enforcement officers as well as agencies. And throughout this nation, heroic deeds and rescues on the part of police occur daily. Certainly mistakes are made, but most often law enforcement in this country is carried out with great skill and professionalism. Nevertheless, when a high-profile episode such as the Brandt Davidian standoff occurs and results in what appears to have been an unnecessary loss of life, America asks why. America and the Congress have a right to know what happened, but in this search, we should not forget the difficult, almost impossible challenges that law enforcement face every day. And so I welcome our distinguished witnesses, the Attorney General of the United States, the FBI Director, and the Director of Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Thank you for being with us, and I look forward to your testimony.
Mr. Edwards, the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I, too, welcome the Attorney General and the other witnesses. We're here today to listen to these witnesses, not necessarily to criticize. The President and the Attorney General have both said that the Congress should study this incident to see if there are any lessons to be learned. And I'm especially interested in the process by which the events were carried out. But, Mr. Chairman, it would be a mistake to view this as a cult issue. Religion had very little to do with the incident. It just as well could have been a white supremacist group or another group whose philosophy and identity had nothing to do with religion. The question is, how does the government deal with highly motivated, coherent groups barricaded in a fortified compound? This is a serious issue and deserves the committee's attention and the attention of the law enforcement agencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 52-day standoff between the FBI and members of the Branch Davidian sect culminated in a fiery inferno which claimed the lives of 86 people. We mourn the loss of all of those inside the compound, especially the 24 children who perished last week and the 4 ATF agents who lost their lives in the initial conflict on February 28th. It certainly appears in the light of the tragic conclusion to the standoff that something went wrong. We need to know why the ATF agents were given the initial order to storm the compound in late February after it seems clear they no longer had the element of surprise in their favor. We also need to know whether the plan put into action on the morning of April 19 was really the best available option, or whether we just ran out of patience in trying to peacefully coax the group out of the compound. We are not here today to second-guess the Attorney General, the FBI, or the ATF, or try to affix political blame. Our purpose today is simply to understand the judgment calls that were made and whether or not those decisions were the most appropriate under the circumstances. We also need to know if adequate resources, including military resources, were available or requested, and if not, why not? We need to get answers from the past so we can learn to avoid similar situations in the future. I look forward to hearing your testimony.
Mr. Schumer, the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for holding this hearing today. And let me say at the outset, I want to express my full confidence in the Attorney General. In my opinion, President Clinton has put an absolutely outstanding person in this difficult job. She's tough, intelligent, and possesses an integrity and forthrightness that is refreshing in Washington. Now, I'm sure that under her leadership, the Justice Department's internal review will produce a complete and thorough report on this entire episode, including a full accounting of any mistakes that may have been made when all the evidence is in. And that's because we're dealing with a new breed of Attorney General, one who's candid about facts and matter-of-fact about taking responsibility. There may well have been errors in judgment in Waco, but we should keep in mind that mistakes in outcome are not always the results of mistakes in judgment. Personally, I'd rather have Janet Reno making these judgments than just about anybody else. We would also do well to remember that we're looking at the actions of law enforcement personnel motivated by a genuine desire to follow the rule of law. We're not dealing with a corrupt or dishonest government agency. We're not dealing with acts of venality or cover-up, as in so many other scandals we have seen. And so I strongly hope we'll keep all this in mind while pursuing our legitimate search to find out what went wrong. To me, there are two key questions we need to explore in order to understand what went wrong. First, why was the element of surprise lost in the initial raid by BATF? If it was, did BATF leadership know that? And if they knew it, what was the process that resulted in going ahead with the raid anyway? Second, what was it that led FBI officials to make the judgment that David Koresh would not destroy himself and his followers when faced with ultimate capture by law enforcement? Now, as we look at these issues and other issues surrounding the tactical and strategic decisions in the matter, I believe it's also important not to lose sight of the fact that the real villain here was David Koresh. He and his followers' desire and willingness to use children as hostages and to ultimately sacrifice them in a ferocious act of self-immolation surely must go down as one of history's most heinous crimes. If our ultimate goal is to avoid future Waco disasters from taking innocent lives, we also have to take a close look at how David Koresh was able to amass one of the largest and most deadly arsenals ever faced by U.S. law enforcement. We need to take a rational look at all the guns involved. More than 10,000 rounds were fired at the BATF agents on February 28th as they attempted to serve legal arrest and search warrants at the Waco compound. This committee will hear today about how Koresh was able to arm his followers with more than 100 fully automatic machine guns, grenades, and other materials such as explosives and bomb components. This is an area where change is surely needed, because once David Koresh had established himself in that compound, surrounded by children and emotionally captive adults, and with that arsenal, he really held all the cards. Can anyone doubt we would be looking at a different outcome had the Branch Davidians been armed only with knives, ordinary hunting rifles, or other sporting weapons? Koresh was determined not to be taken alive, and if necessary, to take every one of his followers and as many federal agents as possible with him. As we have seen graphically, because of weaknesses and loopholes in existing law and his own criminal intent, he had the abundant means to do so. I'll shortly be introducing legislation to address part of the problem by banning the sale of machine gun parts that can be used to convert legal firearms to machine guns unless the purchaser is a legal machine gun owner, and to ban the sale of such parts by mail in all cases. David Koresh used this weakness in the law to amass parts and convert legal weapons to the deadly fully automatic machine guns he fired. This legislation will also prohibit the sale of large caliber ammunition to all but law enforcement and military agencies. The .50 caliber ammunition possessed by Koresh, which although perfectly legal, can easily blow through an ordinary vehicle like a fire truck, has no legitimate purpose in the hands of anyone. Mr. Chairman, I know that this hearing is not specifically about guns. It's about accountability and responsibility. But I also believe if we're going to get beyond the tactical issues involved, we must adopt a strategy that recognizes the role played by guns and the excessive firepower so easily available to a madman. I look forward to hearing our witnesses.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment? Will the gentleman yield?
His opening statement, we want to go to Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Mr. Schumer to yield to him.
Not at this point, no. Mr. Sensenbrenner, the gentleman from Wisconsin, recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I also salute you for calling timely hearings on the disaster in Waco. I think it is very plain that the function of this hearing should not be to second-guess the activities of either the FBI or the Department of Justice, nor should it be to micromanage either of these agencies. That's not the role of the Congress of the United States. And furthermore, we should not be involving politicians in either the executive or legislative branches of government in operational decisions in law enforcement agencies. The people of this country expect the decisions of law enforcement to be free from politics and severely chastise anybody who tries to bring politics into those types of law enforcement decisions. But the Waco operation had a result that none of us desired, and that was the deaths of all of the people who were inside the compound a week ago last Monday. Thus, it's legitimate for this committee, in discharging its oversight functions over law enforcement, to ask what went wrong and how we can learn from the mistakes that were made in the Waco operation to prevent that from happening again. I think that the principal focus of this committee's activity should be to look into the chain of command. What types of options were presented? By whom? Who reviewed those options? And who eventually signed off on those options before April the 19th? In conclusion, I would like to state my personal admiration for the activities and brave behavior of both the FBI and ATF agents who were on the scene in Waco, and again express my personal condolences to the families of those ATF agents who passed away at the time of the first assault. I also think it is important that everybody realize that no one on this committee holds anyone but David Koresh responsible for the tragic deaths of those who died within that compound. He was the one that brought them there, he was the one that kept them there, and he was the one that led them to their deaths in the fire that occurred at the time the FBI stormed the compound a week ago Monday. Anybody that seriously says that the FBI or law enforcement was at fault really didn't know what was happening down there or cared not to listen. So I would hope that we could get into the business of overseeing the FBI, the Justice Department, and the ATF here so that all of us can learn from this very tragic activity and so that the word can go out to anybody that is contemplating holding innocent people hostages, as Mr. Koresh did, that law enforcement will be able to get to them and hopefully have a result that will bring those who are guilty of committing crimes to justice in a court of law, rather than the tragic outcome that occurred in Waco.
Thank you very much. And I would, at this point, want to recognize the presence of Congressman Chet Edwards of Texas, whose district was the location of the Branch Davidian compound. And without objection, I would recognize a statement from the congressman regarding the subject matter of these hearings be entered into the record at this point. Thank you very much, Congressman.
Mr. Chairman, I understand that members such as Mr. Moorhead, who did leave a statement, will be any members who have a statement at this point. They can.
All members who have statements at this point will be put into the record, and this record will be open for a few days in case you have some time to perfect your statement to be put in the record at this point.
Thank you.
And now I'm delighted to welcome Attorney General Janet Reno to the committee in her first appearance before us since being sworn in. We're familiar with her background as a result of the confirmation hearings. However, for those who are not, I just tell you a little bit about her. From 1978 until the time of her appointment as Attorney General, Mrs. Reno was a state attorney in Miami, Florida. She's been partner in a Miami-based law firm, an assistant state attorney, staff director of the Florida House of Representatives Judiciary Committee. She comes from good Florida stock, feeling every bit at home, as much with alligators as with the more dangerous predators she's encountered on this side of the Potomac. And, Madam Attorney General, while we regret the sad events that necessitated this hearing, we welcome you. We look forward to your testimony. You proceed as you see fit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Can everybody hear me? I truly appreciate this opportunity to appear before you to discuss the tragic events at the compound in Waco, Texas this past week. I want to be as open as possible with you and with all the American people about what we knew before, what we knew on that day, and what we know now, and as our investigation proceeds. I want to be responsible and accountable to the Congress and to the American people in every way I possibly can. This is one of the hardest decisions that anybody could ever be asked to make. We deliberated long and carefully before reaching a decision. Nothing we do now can change the suffering felt by the families of the ATF agents or the families of those who perished in the compound. But as you have pointed out so eloquently, we must do everything we can to learn from these events about what we can do in the future to prevent people like David Koresh or people motivated by other thoughts from causing such a senseless, horrible loss of human life. On February 28, 1993, 4 agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms were killed and 16 were injured in a shootout that occurred when they attempted to execute an arrest warrant for Vernon Howell, also known as David Koresh, and a search warrant at the Branch Davidian compound near Waco, Texas. The agents were met by a barrage of gunfire from numerous firing points in the compound that lasted 45 minutes, involved thousands of rounds of ammunition, and left the agents dead and injured. Weapons used by the Branch Davidians included .50 caliber rifles having an effective range of 3,000 yards from the Capitol to the White House. All of those killed or wounded were shot or injured by homemade hand grenades. While several members of the commune were killed and injured, there was apparently no serious injury to any of the children. After the shootout, the remaining ATF agents established a protective perimeter around the compound. A few hours later, 3 Branch Davidians attempted to enter the compound, resulting in a second shootout with ATF agents in which 1 Davidian was killed. Attempts were made to further secure the perimeter. ATF officials then requested that the FBI dispatch its Hostage Rescue Team, which we refer to as HRT. On February 28, 1993, agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, including the HRT, arrived on the scene. The FBI found an armed fortress, a compound consisting of approximately 70 acres, located on Route 7 near Waco. I took office on March 12, 1993. After my FBI clearance, I had been briefed previously by the acting Attorney General and was thereafter briefed specifically on the situation at Waco. I was advised that the primary goal of the FBI's hostage rescue team was to negotiate with Koresh to secure the release of the children and the surrender and prosecution of all those who participated in the murder and assault of the federal agents without further violence or injury to anyone concerned. I concurred that we must try to negotiate to avoid further bloodshed to the extent that we could. As this situation evolved, the FBI had consistently rejected a direct assault on the compound because of the danger of heavy casualties to the agents and to the children, and because of the layout which prevented a surprise assault. I was told, as I was briefed, that the FBI had a trained negotiator on the scene, and that they had, and during the course of these deliberations, continued to consult with behavioral experts and others who had knowledge of the cult to determine how best to proceed to negotiate with Koresh. From the start, the negotiation tactics focused on restricting the activities of those inside the compound and depriving them of a comfortable environment so as to bring the matter to a conclusion without further violence. Those inside the compound were advised of the FBI's rules of engagement. Under those rules, the agents conveyed the information that they would not use deadly force against any person except as necessary in self-defense or defense of another, when they had reason to believe that they or another were in danger of death or grievous bodily harm. The FBI installed lights to illuminate the compound at night and loudspeakers to ensure that they could communicate with all members of the compound at once, rather than having to rely solely on the single telephone line available to speak to Koresh and those he permitted to talk on the phone. They also used loudspeakers to disrupt their sleep. They cut off their electricity, and they sought to restrict communications of those within the compound just to the hostage negotiators. Additionally, they sent in letters from family members and made other good faith efforts designed to encourage surrender by those who wished to leave the compound. In particular, and I asked about this during the course of our deliberations, they made repeated efforts to secure the release of the children. In further efforts to encourage the negotiating process, attorneys representing Koresh and Steve Schneider were allowed to enter the compound or communicate by telephone with them on several occasions. Throughout this 51-day process, Koresh continued to assert that he and others inside would at some point surrender. However, the FBI advised that at no point did he keep his word on any of his promises. Despite all efforts, the negotiators concluded that negotiations were at a standstill and that they had not been able to negotiate a single item with Koresh. Although 21 children and 14 adults had been allowed to leave the compound between February 28th and March 23rd, 1993, those persons who left the compound did so because Koresh affirmatively wanted them out, as they were not fully committed to his cause, they were a drain on his efforts in internal discipline and resources, or he viewed them as potential spokesmen to the media. During the week of April the 5th, the FBI advised me that they were developing a plan for the possible use of tear gas in an effort to increase the pressure on those in the compound to surrender. Thereafter, I had a series of meetings with the FBI to discuss the emerging proposal. The threshold question I asked was whether the gas would cause permanent injury to the children. I did not even want to consider the matter further if we could not be certain about this factor. The FBI assured me that the gas would not cause permanent injury. I asked them to research further, and subsequently they arranged for me to meet with Dr. Harry Salem, a top expert in toxicology who is chief of the Life Sciences Department at the Edgewood Arsenal. He reviewed with me case studies that confirmed that it would not cause permanent injury. Then the primary question I asked again and again during the ensuing discussion was, why now? Why not wait? I asked about their food and water supply and was told that it could last at least a year or more. I asked that the information about the water supply be checked and double-checked by observing the level in the water tanks. We explored but could not develop a feasible method for cutting off their water supply. I asked my staff to have direct personal discussions by phone with the chief negotiator on the scene to satisfy ourselves that we had indeed reached an impasse in discussions and negotiations. After a 2.5-hour conversation, that seemed clear. I became convinced that short of allowing David Koresh to go free, he was not coming out voluntarily. Given that unacceptable result, in light of the fact that he was such a dangerous criminal, allowing the status quo to remain was not going to lead to an ultimate peaceful resolution and eliminate any risk to the safety of the innocent children in the compound, the public at large, or the government agents at the scene. On the contrary, the passage of time only increased the likelihood of incidents and possible injuries and attendant injuries and harm. But we continued to deliberate, and in the course of our deliberations, we met with General Peter Schumacher and Colonel Jerry Boykin, former and present commanders of Delta Force, respectively, the Army's rough equivalent to the FBI's HRT, to review the plan. Their comments were instructive. While indicating that the plan appeared to be sound, one suggestion was that rather than an incremental approach to the use of the gas as proposed by the FBI, gas should be inserted into all portions of the compound simultaneously. I preferred the FBI approach, which called for a gradual increase in pressure over time. It seemed to me that that would be best to ensure the safety of those inside. I directed that if at any point Koresh or his followers threatened to harm the children, the FBI should cease the action immediately. Likewise, if it appeared that as a result of the initial use of tear gas, Koresh was prepared to negotiate in good faith for his ultimate surrender, the FBI was to cease operation. On the other hand, if Koresh and his followers endangered the agents by firing upon them, they were authorized to return the fire. To the great credit of the FBI, they received substantial fire from within the compound, both at the vehicles and at sniper positions surrounding the compound, without returning any fire. In fact, throughout the 51-day siege, the FBI never fired a single shot. Instead, when fired upon, the FBI responded by beginning to insert gas throughout the compound, consistent with what the Delta Force commanders had suggested. Commanders also expressed concern about the length of time the HRT had been on the scene in a state of constant readiness, and all expressed the view that the team would have to be pulled back for retraining very quickly if they were going to come back to the scene. All advised that there was not a substitute civil force that could secure the extensive area around the compound that had the expertise of the hostage rescue team. We continued deliberations. I wanted and received assurances that the gas and its means of use were not pyrotechnic. I was concerned about intentional or accidental explosions and ordered that additional resources be provided to ensure that there was an adequate emergency response if we should go forward. And I also considered that Koresh had talked about suicide, and that might occur at any time under conditions that the FBI might be less likely to control. Experts, however, advised the Bureau that the chances of suicide were not likely. But I again emphasized that it was something that was considered that might happen at any point along the way, regardless of what the FBI did. In considering the FBI proposal, I weighed the many concerns of the government with respect to the state of affairs inside the compound. They included the well-being of the children in the compound, given the deteriorating sanitary conditions, the apparent lack of adequate medical care inside, and reports of sexual and other abuse over the past. The vulnerability of the outer perimeter, which created a threat to public safety and the federal agents at the perimeter. The outer perimeter was vulnerable because there were inside the compound 50 caliber weapons having an effective killing range of 3,000 yards, a distance that would reach from the U.S. Capitol to the White House. Our inability to maintain the presence of the HRT on site indefinitely, and the advice I received that there was a lack of a suitable substitute force that could replace them at the compound and ensure the security of all involved. Fourth, the increasing risk as the standoff continued of injury to federal agents, whether by accident or by the risk of shooting from the inside. Since being sworn in as Attorney General, I have had numerous conversations with people both inside and outside the Department of Justice concerning the Waco situation. In addition, I directed my staff to keep the White House apprised of ongoing developments. My discussions with representatives at the White House were predicated on the premise that as Chief Law Enforcement Officer, the decision on how to proceed was mine. I advised the President on the Sunday before the operation of my decision to authorize the FBI's use of tear gas at the compound, and he said he would support my decision. I believe we were dealing with a situation that would not resolve itself by mere acquiescence to the standoff. Negotiations had proven to be fruitless, and despite our best efforts, we could not secure the release of the children. It was a situation that suggested to me that time would only increase the risk to public safety, to the safety of government agents, and to those within the compound, without any realistic expectation that the matter would be resolved peacefully if we did nothing. It was my call, and I made it the best way I know how. Let me urge that we focus on the future and to try to determine how we can best avoid the recurrence of this tragedy. In this regard, at the President's request, we in the Department of Treasury are looking at a process whereby the events at Waco will be examined by experts both within and outside the government to consider the following questions. 1, in the execution of the arrest and search warrants by ATF, were established procedures followed, and if so, were they adequate? 2, is federal law enforcement adequately prepared to negotiate in dangerous situations in terms of training, staffing, and available techniques? 3, is training for the execution of warrants involving barricaded suspects who may be holding innocent third parties adequate for all law enforcement agencies? 4, are improvements needed in coordinating the activity of the various investigative agencies? 5, how should federal law enforcement agencies marshal resources in various disciplines, including psychology and psychiatry, in situations involving cults and other groups using barricades and holding innocent people? 6, what systems and understandings about command and control should guide the relationships among leaders of the departments and career officials and operating units when field operations impose a substantial risk of danger to law enforcement officials and others? The incident at Waco ended tragically for all involved. I have thought every day since April 19th about what I might have done differently. I only hope that we can work together to make sure that I never have to make such a decision again. I would be glad to answer any of your questions.
Well, Mrs. Reno, the major focus of today's hearing is the decision-making process at the highest levels of law enforcement community, which led to the actions involving the Branch Davidian cult. Could you describe for the committee the major considerations you personally brought to bear in approving the actions leading up to and including the April 19th operation?
The prime concern that I ask is the question I kept asking over and over again, Mr. Chairman: why now? Why not wait? I reviewed statements that he had made about apocalypse at any time. He could have done this at any time. The FBI advised me that they were in better control considering the state of readiness of their HRT teams, so that was a definite factor. I reviewed it was important, and we spent a lot of time determining the water supply. I thought that might be a way, if the water supply were reduced, that we might be able to force them out. And again we went back through trying to observe the level of water in the tanks to see if it might be possible to wait them out in that fashion. It appeared from everything that we were told, based on our discussion with the negotiator on the scene, who advised that negotiations had reached an impasse, that he was going to stay there and he would not come out voluntarily, and it was going to be an indefinite stay that would expose the lives of agents on the perimeter to danger, would threaten the continued safety of all inside. I continued to be concerned about the children. There was no sanitary facility for them. They were dumping their waste. The conditions were increasing in that regard. We had had reports, and as I have pointed out, until you see the children, you cannot confirm the reports one way or the other about the abuse of the children. But the concern I had was that to let this go on indefinitely, where you had dangerous offenders who had killed 4 agents, injured 16 others, was something that could best be resolved by increasing the pressure, not to make this D-Day, but to try to increase the pressure by the use of gas, which I had determined by, after very careful review, would not be permanently harmful to the children, that by tear gassing the compound, that would be the best way to proceed, to increase the pressure to try to force them out.
Now, Ms. Reno, questions have been raised about the extent to which the White House was involved in the decision-making process relative to the events in Waco. Could you describe the extent and the nature of your contact with the White House during the standoff, and particularly during the days preceding April the 19th?
I kept the White House advised through the White House counsel's office during the course of my deliberations after the FBI had made its proposal about the use of gas. There were continued discussions as we developed new information. On Sunday, prior to April the 19th, I talked with the President, advised him of what we proposed to do, and he gave me his full support.
Would you describe in detail how you kept in touch with the situation in Waco and the individuals with whom you consulted in formulating and approving the actions against the Branch Davidian compound?
The first conversation I had concerning the possible use of tear gas at the compound was with Director Sessions, who said that during the week of April the 5th that he would like to arrange some time to brief me on a proposal that they would like to present. I met with Director Sessions and other representatives of the department, including Floyd Clark, Larry Potts, Doug Gow, and there may have been others, but those are the people that I specifically remember. I was briefed in all details about everything that had been done up to that point in trying to resolve the matter peacefully. We went through it in detail. Then I started asking the questions. What about the gas? Would it be harmful to the children? Go back and do some more study. I had real concern about that. It was pointed out to me after they had had the doctor brief me that the gas was non-lethal. It was tear gas as we understand tear gas, and that members of the United States Army are gassed as part of preparation. So I became comfortable with that, but I was still not comfortable with the primary question of why now, why not wait? We had explored other possible alternatives. As I suggested to you, the FBI, before I had been sworn in, and then I concurred totally with them, rejected any direct assault on the compound as being far too dangerous for the agents and for those inside the compound. We asked to meet with military officials, and the general, who was the former commander of Delta Force, and the colonel presently commanding the Delta Force came to Washington and met with us and FBI officials after they reviewed the plan, and we consulted very carefully about that. One of the points raised for the first time by the Delta Force commanders and previous commander was that the HRT had to be at a constant state of readiness, and that to keep them on a scene for the length of time that these agents had been on the scene began to raise questions that they could not remain there much longer and still be in the state of readiness that should be expected of an HRT team. I asked, well, isn't there another team, and was advised no, except for the Delta Force, and then I believe that the Navy has a force for marine disasters. We explored the provisions of posse comitatus and became convinced that you could not use the Delta Force in a civil situation. I asked at that time, well, can't you send in SWAT teams or something like that? I'm not a law enforcement expert, but I was asking every question I knew to ask. And they explained and went step by step through the training that the HRT team has in terms of sniper firing and their ability to maintain security. So I became convinced that if we had to pull back the HRT team and substitute somebody else, we couldn't begin to provide the security for all of those concerned that we would with the HRT. I continued to be concerned about the water tank because I heard some information that indicated their water supply might be low. We went back in, and with the ability of the FBI to determine the level of the water tank from a distance, we were advised that it continued to be replenished and that it looked like they had enough supplies and water to last for over a year. What concerned me was the fact that even with the HRT team, it was going to be difficult to control a perimeter. If you can imagine having to control a perimeter that extended from here to the White House and the same distance either way, it could be a very difficult situation. People had been able to get in there, and people could come out. There could be confrontations. We reviewed, because I directly considered the fact that people had talked about the possibility of a mass suicide, and you remember the situation with respect to Jonestown, and that's something I considered. The FBI advised me that its behavioral experts had indicated, and by the way, Mr. Chairman, I've asked the FBI, because I want to be as candid as I possibly can, to interrupt me if I say anything that's inaccurate in any way. And I would ask that because I want to make sure that I lay out the clearest picture possible for you in terms of any advice that they gave me. But we looked at it. They advised me again that their experts had concluded that the chances of a mass suicide were not likely. But if they were, they could happen at any time. And if we let this standoff go on forever, it could happen if you got some rambunctious group in there that wanted to square off against the Davidians. It could happen in any number of ways. I went step by step again through the decisions, weighing it back and forth, and reached a conclusion that the gas was not lethal, that it would not permanently harm them. By everybody's description, it would be they could last with gas masks for some time, but it would become so uncomfortable that they would come out. I think as a footnote to this, one of the things we didn't count on was that wind. And I think one of the things that we will have to review and look at and understand is why the gas didn't cause more discomfort as immediately. But those were the factors that led to my decision. And constantly during this time, I was consulting and trying to be available at their request to the Director, to Mr. Clark, Mr. Potts, and Mr. Gow.
Well, thank you very much. In accordance with the rules of the committee, I want to note that while I've asked only 3 questions, we want to adhere strictly to the 5-minute limit because I want all of the members to have an opportunity to make their positions clear. Mr. Fish.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and General Reno, I commend you for your frankness. I would like at the outset to take a step back and ask you a threshold question. What was the reason, or perhaps reasons, that federal law enforcement personnel were there at the compound in the first place? Was there a serious enough threat posed by the Branch Davidians to justify the ATF raid, and following that, the 52-day stakeout, as well as the FBI action on April 19th?
Congressman, I have focused my attention on Department of Justice activities and on the FBI, and I would refer matters that preceded February 28th to the investigation that will be conducted. I have not reviewed that in terms of making any informed comment on what led up to it. What I did satisfy myself was that 4 agents had been killed 15 had been wounded by very dangerous people, and that the FBI had been called in. When I took office, that was the situation that I was faced with, and I made a judgment based on all the information that I had that they were indeed dangerous offenders who had knowingly killed federal agents. But at that point, with the tragedy of the agent's death, the 15 wounded, the issues with respect to the siege, I did not want to be in the process of second-guessing somebody else.
Well, thank you. General Reno, excuse me,
Gentleman, you
of
have one
course.
moment. I would say to the members of the public, let me say that we would ask that you rotate, that is, leave the committee room every 20 minutes, because there are 150 or more people outside patiently waiting to come in for a while. And if you would stay 20 minutes and rotate out, it would give others an opportunity to participate in and hear this public hearing. Pardon me, Mr. Fish.
Thank you. General Reno, you've demonstrated both personal courage and professionalism in your willingness to take responsibility for the decisions that led to the events of April 19th. But while you're ready to take the public responsibility, it does not mean you actually made the decisions. As to the tactics, whose idea was it to use the tear gas and the tanks? Who actually made the decision to move in that manner and on the particular day?
The FBI made the decision to bring in the tanks, and the tanks were on the scene, as I recall, when I was sworn in on March the 12th, 1993. So CEVs, as they were called, which were, I believe, are construction equipment vehicles, and Bradley vehicles, and, as I recall, a tank were already on the scene. The proposal that was made to me was made by the FBI to use tear gas inserted in order to protect those involved and to protect the agents involved from the weapons that were inside the compound, that it would be inserted with what I came to refer to as a CEV, which is a tank-like vehicle with a boom on the front of the tank.
Attorney General, the April 25th issue of the Washington Post Outlook section, Richard Restak, R-E-S-T-A-K, a neurologist and neuropsychiatrist, author of 8 books on brain behavior, had this to say: unfortunately, in dealing with psychotics, negotiations may take weeks or months, but not waiting is extremely dangerous. Psychotics respond very erratically under pressure. Indeed, if a person could deal effectively with stress, he would not have descended into psychosis in the first place. Unfortunately, those making the decisions about what to do about Koresh unwittingly set up situations from the beginning that could almost be guaranteed to further his descent into madness. Even a well-adjusted person could decompensate, as doctors say, under the pressures of psychological warfare techniques like aiming high-intensity floodlights at the compound or playing loud, irritating tapes of jet planes and the cries of rabbits being slaughtered. Such techniques can be successful when applied to individuals whose responses can reasonably be anticipated. But if there's one thing the authorities surrounding the compound at Waco can agree about, it is that David Koresh was not predictable. My question, General Reno, is, with the benefit of hindsight and recognizing that you were dealing with a psychotic who was not likely to respond rationally to stress, efforts to break down his resistance, the increasing of the pressure, and so forth, should a similar situation arise in the future, would you recommend a course different from the law enforcement procedure applied in the Davidian standoff?
What I want to do, Congressman, is talk with Mr. Restak, because I saw this article and reviewed it at the time that this past Sunday. Talk with any other expert I can. Brief them on everything we try to do and try to understand whether a man like David Koresh, whom he calls unpredictable and whom everybody agrees was unpredictable, if there is any other way to have done it. One of the things that I've learned is never believe everything you read in a newspaper. And the second thing is make sure that the person who writes the story in the newspaper, who's being as accurate as they know how, have all the information concerning the subject matter of which they write, before relying on their conclusions. And with Mr. Restak, Mr. Adams, and others who have suggested that they might have had a better way, that is what I intend to try to do.
I thank you for that. On page 5 of your testimony, you say that to determine how best to negotiate, the FBI was consulting with behavioral experts and others. And yet, as you know, the result of the techniques used in psychological warfare only served to make Mr. Koresh more irritable and prone to angry outbursts. So my questions are, upon what information was this strategy of psychological warfare based, and who are the experts that were consulted?
The FBI will testify after I do, and they will give you in detail just whom they consulted with and sometimes the conflicting information that was given. In fact, and I think it will be important to hear from the FBI in terms of his outburst, at times he was very peaceful. You were dealing with a madman, Congressman, and he was totally unpredictable. What we will do is sit down with the experts that we consulted with those who now have opinions as to how we might have proceeded, and try to come up with the best understanding of what to do with people like him or others in other situations for the future.
To your knowledge, were biblical scholars, theologians involved as experts, either in consultation or in negotiation?
My understanding, because I directly asked it, is that the Bureau, the FBI, had consulted with religious experts to understand the significance of the various biblical references during the course of the negotiations.
But not to negotiate directly with Mr. Koresh?
I don't know of any negotiation in which a religious person directly negotiated, but you should inquire of the FBI.
I shall. Thank you very much, General Reno.
Mr. Edwards, gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your forthright testimony, Madam Attorney General. I was interested in Congressman Fish's questions. Did the FBI tell you that they had examined previous experiences by the Department of Justice in situations such as this? I'm not talking about the ordinary hostage where day-to-day criminals are involved, where highly motivated types of people like, as I said in my opening statement, white supremacists or religious people who have some kind of a cult attitude were involved. Did they tell you that they had examined what happened in San Francisco a number of years ago when Indians took over Alcatraz Island, and the president, happened to be President Nixon at that time, said, let them stay and they'll get tired of it. And they did. They stayed over a year, and then they got tired of it and left. And had they also looked into what the federal government, the Department of Justice, did at Pine Ridge, where a similar waiting period worked out rather well?
I do not recall any reference to Alcatraz nor to Pine Ridge specifically, Congressman. Again, what we were dealing with here was not somebody who had just taken over a place, but people who were dangerous in terms of the surrounding community, who had killed people, and a perimeter which had to be secured. And as I recall, we discussed whether we had ever seen a situation. I'd obviously not seen a situation like that in my experience in Miami, but whether we had ever really seen anything precisely like this. And my information was that we had not. But I would refer you to the Bureau in order to make sure that the Department of Justice's representations are as accurate as possible.
Well, I think we will have quite a lot of questions for the FBI, because after all, you were only there less than half the time that the siege was going on. I guess, Mr. Chairman, that I will yield back my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Carlos Moorhead, the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, one question I'd like to ask, and you may not be the one to ask this, but why was the press notified prior to the BATF going in there to begin with? Because obviously they knew about what was going to happen inside the perimeter. And in one of the briefings we got, it was stated that one of the people that came from inside was notified by a pressman about what was going to happen, and they knew about the thing. Why did that ever happen? Why is the press notified?
Congressman, again, I have tried to focus my responsibility and my review on the issues that the Department of Justice confronted, and I would respectfully refer you to ATF.
All right. My next question is, you state in your opening statement that the big question you had was whether the gas could cause permanent injury to the children. Was there any consideration about whether this attack using the tanks and gas could be successful or would be successful? And did anyone weigh the damage that could come, the possible harm against the possible good?
When I say the big question, that was the threshold question. I wasn't even going to consider using gas unless I could be sure that it would not be permanently harmful to children. So that was the threshold question before I began the deliberations. We then continued with the big question being, why now? Why not wait? We reviewed, and those were the alternatives. I reviewed it. I became convinced that the gas was not harmful, that the gas, as described by the commanding officer of Delta Force and by the head of the HRT, the FBI hostage rescue team, would force the people in the compound out. As I have said, I took into consideration that there were concerns expressed that Koresh might commit a mass suicide, that he might commit suicide. I expressed concerns that he might put the children up against the window and threaten to do things to the children. And I gave specific instructions that if anything like that should happen, we should fall back immediately. But the issue was, based on what we had been told and the comments made by Koresh, that if he were going to do something like what he did, he could do it and might do it at any time, particularly when the Bureau had less control of the situation than it had with the HRT team on the site. Based on what the commanding officers of Delta Force told us and what the HRT team told us, the gas was going to be so uncomfortable that they would come out rather quickly. Some would be more immune to it than others. They would have gas masks. We knew they had gas masks, and that might give them a longer period of time before they came out, but that they would come out. One of the things that I was concerned about, I kept thinking of what can be the worst case scenario, and what I envisioned was that he would do something terrible like set an explosion. And I just balanced it with the fact that this was something that he had threatened to do that I could not control based on all the information that we had, everything we had been told. He could stay there for over a year. It was something that I felt that we were in the best position to bring to a conclusion by increasing the pressure through the use of gas.
But there were children being let out from time to time, and other people that were in there were deciding to leave under the pressure and had already left. I don't know how many able-bodied men were inside of this place, but it would seem to me that their ability to resist was being cut down by the people that were being allowed to leave. And it just seems to me that some gain could be there by letting time go on. I know it was costing $1 million a day, and that's a lot of money. But there's a lot that weighed against all the lives that were lost. It doesn't sound like that heavy an expense.
Congressman, you don't consider dollars when you consider human lives, and that was not a factor that I considered at all. What I tried to consider was the best way to resolve it over time with the least danger to all involved. Most of the people who had come out early on. They were in there, they weren't coming out, they were heavily armed, they had .50 caliber ammunition that could fire a distance from here to the White House. They were not somebody that was a non-dangerous offender who was sitting there because they wanted to take over a place. These were dangerous people who had killed and who had the chance of killing again.
We understand that, obviously. But we learned in Jonestown that being pressed, these people that are a little bit warped to begin with, do go to suicide many times. And the pressure down there was very soft, just that one of our members of Congress had shown up and they thought he might be a danger, and they caused all that damage there. This guy was very similar to...
Congressman, we will welcome any suggestions you have as to any issue that we might review to avoid a tragedy like this for the future. Nobody will ever know what the right answer was in this situation, and I think we have to collectively work together to come up with the best guidelines, the best procedures, to try our level best to avoid a tragedy such as this in the future.
Well, we can't do anything about this one, but I think we can learn a lot for the next time that something like this comes up. And history has told us those things repeat themselves.
Well, I'm trying my best to make sure that I have exhausted every possibility of learning everything I can in the course of these next several weeks that can avoid a tragedy like this in the future, if it's possible. In some instances, with a madman like that, it may not be.
Thank you very much. Mr. Conyers, gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Attorney General, I am extremely disappointed in the decisions that have been made out of the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Agency of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. In Philadelphia, we had a mayor that bombed people out of an eviction. In Jonestown, we lost the lives of my colleague, Congressman Ryan, who tried to get Don Edwards to go out there with him because of a miscalculation about cult people. We had Patty Hearst in the Symbionese Liberation Army. We had Wounded Knee with the Indians. Now, when in God's name is the law enforcement at the federal level going to understand that these are very sensitive events, that you can't put barbed wire, guns, FBI, Secret Service around them, send in sound 24 hours a day and night, and then wonder why they do something unstable? The root cause of this problem was that it was considered a military operation, and it wasn't. This is a profound disgrace to law enforcement in the United States of America. And you did the right thing by offering to resign. You did exactly the right thing. I commend you for it. Now, there is no longer any reason why the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency cannot be folded into the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And if there is some reason for continuing ATF, I'd like to hear it today. And I'll be introducing legislation to that point very, very shortly. And now I'd like you to know that there is at least one member in the Congress that isn't going to rationalize the death of 24 children that weren't cultists, they weren't nuts, they weren't criminals. They happened to be the parents of people, and they were innocently trapped in there. And that decision that was jointly made by these agencies bears extreme criticism. And it's not President Clinton's fault. He's taking your advice. He's taking Judge Sessions' advice. He's taking Mr. Powell's advice. And so I'd like to get some straight answers. I've read so many conflicting rationales about this that it's absolutely embarrassing. And I've been through each of these incidents that I've cited. Doesn't anybody have any historical recollection in federal law enforcement about how to deal with these kinds of people? And I'll yield the balance of my time for anything you'd like to respond to me, Madam Attorney General.
I haven't tried to rationalize the death of children, Congressman. I feel more strongly about it than you will ever know. But I have neither tried to rationalize the death of 4 ATF agents, and I will not walk away from a compound where ATF agents have been killed by people who knew they were agents and leave them unsurrounded. I will not authorize a military excursion with the forces of the military into that compound with a direct assault such as what you might expect in a military situation. I will stand by and be proud of the FBI as it used its restraint. But most of all, Congressman, I will not engage in recrimination. I will look to the future, try to learn everything I can from this situation to avoid tragedies such as this in the future.
Are you concluded?
I'm not concluded. If you have further questions of me, sir.
Well, I consider that a non-responsive answer.
You did not ask me a question, sir. You asked me if I had any comment, and I responded with my...
consider those non-responsive comments.
Do you have a question of me, sir?
I have more questions of you than I'll ever get time to put before you.
I am prepared for as long as you would like to question me, sir, and
well,
I will come to your office.
Well, ask the chairman to give me some more time.
I will come to your office and be prepared to answer any question at any time that you may ever have about anything that I have ever done.
Well, I'll thank the gentlelady and accept her invitation.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Hyde.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hopefully a little change of pace. I just want to comment that all of us are sometimes victimized, and I use the word with some caution, by experts. We rely on experts a little bit too much sometimes, and we should be more aware of the fact that there are experts, and there are experts, and there are experts. And it would seem to me common sense would dictate that suicide was a real possibility. Dealing with people who are religiously obsessed in a aberrant or bizarre direction, and with the history of the Jonestown where 900 people lost their lives, to say suicide is not a real possibility, I would wonder if all the experts said that. Now, I know you don't know because you relied on the FBI, who was told by experts. And I'll ask Mr. Sessions and others whether that was a unanimous view or whether there were other experts and they chose to believe one set of experts and gave you that information. But you don't know that, and so I certainly don't ask you that. But you've made a statement that only the hostage rescue team was appropriate to accomplish the mission they were assigned in this operation. And then we note that fatigue had set in on the hostage rescue team. And that troubles me because evidently we only have one hostage rescue team. Maybe we have two. I understand it's made up of 50 people, and there are two groups of them, 25 and 25. But the inability to wait out these people does trouble me, the impatience. And if there was no backup, if there were no people to relieve the hostage rescue team, then I'm concerned about that. Because if indeed we have hostage situations on both coasts simultaneously, one in Seattle and one in Pensacola, and we only have one team, we're in trouble. So I have made inquiry as to why we didn't have adequate backup. If indeed only a hostage rescue team is appropriate, the Delta Force is out, SWAT teams are out, whatever. Theologians trying to seduce these people to come out, all of that is inappropriate, and we have to rely on a hostage rescue team, and we don't have adequate resources. So I tried to find out why. I thought perhaps Congress was to blame, that we wouldn't provide the funds that the FBI has asked for funds to train more hostage rescue teams, and Congress wouldn't give them the funds. If so, then it's our fault. But I learned no, that the FBI has asked for additional funds to train additional hostage rescue teams, but they've been denied that by OMB, certainly not this OMB, the previous OMBs, Office of Management and Budget, and previous Justice Departments. And so I guess the moral of the story is, if you're taking testimony from people and you want to know what's going on, you better know the right questions to ask, because I never knew the shortage of hostage rescue teams. And I think if Congress knew of that, we would be forthcoming with appropriate funds, because hostage taking cannot be confined to one incident at a time. And so I just ask you, is it not a fact that we didn't have sufficient backup? They did get fatigued, and it would have been helpful if they did have backup if Congress had provided the funds.
One of the things I'm not is an expert on how hostage rescue teams should be staffed or deployed, and I would, respectfully defer to the FBI, who I think can furnish information to you concerning budget requests that have been made. But one of the things that we are in the process of doing is to determine just what appropriate staffing levels should exist, even if this situation could be resolved in short order. If there had been another situation, an airplane hijacking or something such as that. And we'd like to approach it in a very orderly way to make a recommendation to Congress.
Well, sure, and I'm going to try to know what questions to ask the next time the FBI appears before our subcommittee, so things they need and want, we can elicit from them, maybe going around or underneath or over the OMB or the Justice Department. Thank you.
Mr. Romano Mazzoli, the gentleman from Kentucky.
You're getting closer, Mr. Chairman. Another couple of years, you'll get it right. We appreciate that.
You'll still be a subcommittee chairman.
Yeah, I know. That's right. I know how tough it is for Texans to wrap their tongues around the word Romano. But in any event, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having the hearings. We appreciate it. I think all of us applaud the heroism of the FBI, of the ATF, of the good people that my friend Chet Edwards represents down in Waco, the sheriff's departments, the fire department people who showed up at the place. We grieve, obviously, the ATF agents who were killed, the 16 who were wounded, their families, and as my colleague from Michigan has said, we grieve the children who perished and all of the adults in the compound. We applaud you, General Reno. We know that you've done a very good job and you've had a very difficult first encounter with the life that you'll live as our Attorney General. And I applaud you for taking responsibility. I think that's in the spirit of public service, and we appreciate that. And just like my friend from Illinois, Mr. Hyde, is saying, we want to help you do the job better. So if it comes to appropriations or monies or things like that, we hope you're not at all hesitant, even if it means breaking from the administration in some respects, to tell us what you really think your department really needs. Because too often we've sat here at hearings and we've had members from other administrations come up and act as a loyal soldier and carrying out their instructions, failing to ask for what they know they should have, and they fail, therefore, to get it, and then sometimes there's a failure down the line. So we hope that you'll say that, and we certainly hold only responsible here David Koresh and those people who followed his persuasion. And I think, as you've said, what we need now to do is look to the future, try to develop some ways to avoid these horrible carnages. And in looking to the future, we'll not at all question the valor, the heroism, the great devotion and dedication of all the people who were down there for those 50 days and are still down there trying to figure out what went on. But I think it is correct, and certainly I glean from your own questions in your statements, that we have to look at the training, we have to look at the techniques, we have to look at the coordination, we have to look at the professional skills that the people who act in your behalf and our behalf are up to the task that they would face. And in that setting, I would ask this question. In some of the television that occurred soon after the blaze at the compound, families said they pleaded with President Clinton. They sent fax messages to the White House, apparently pleaded with you, maybe pleaded with the FBI, maybe with the ATF. Let some of the family members go in there and see if they couldn't reason and solve the problem. My question is, did you ever say no to those requests? Did they ever reach your desk? Are you aware of the FBI ever having denied family members an opportunity to intercede?
Those requests never reached my desk, and I'm not aware of that. You would have to check with the FBI on that. I'm not familiar.
Aware of whether they existed at all?
That's correct.
Nor whether they were denied? Let me ask you, are you aware of, and the question was raised, a lot of callers apparently watching on television the blaze in live coverage called the fire departments and called FBI and say, why aren't the fire departments there? Now, we realize all the logistical problems of water on the scene, of long-distance rifles with capability of killing the fire people who might respond. Are you aware of any discussions when you had with all these people leading up to this misadventure that the question of available fire department personnel, available water, special pumps, auxiliary electrical supplies was ever brought up?
I never specifically discussed fire vehicles. I just discussed a sufficient emergency response because, as I indicated to you, what I envisioned was even if he didn't do something, there might be an accidental explosion considering all the ammunition. And I directed that there be sufficient emergency vehicles to respond both from a medical and another point of view, but I did not specifically address the issue of fire vehicles.
I'm very proud of the work our firefighters do around the country, and we have a fire caucus here on the Hill, and these people are trained beyond almost any enforcement officers in responding to emergency, whether they involve fire, hazardous or toxic smoke, whether they involve giving first aid and immediate rescue to people, but apparently they weren't involved here.
You would have to ask the Bureau exactly what circumstances that they worked out with the fire departments.
Let me ask you one other question, General Reno. I have read, and I may not be asking the right person the question, I have read that Koresh was a jogger, and that there were times during these 51 days when he went out for his exercise. He came away from the compound and was jogging in that area, I guess, that was cordoned off. Are you aware of that having been the case, and whether or not any of your discussions dealt with what could be done while he was absent the compound?
I never addressed that. The only thing, I never heard of Koresh being outside the compound other than just to go outside, but my understanding from the Bureau was that they were trying to restrain the boundary, the perimeter immediately around the compound by increasing pressure.
But I mean, I'm talking about jogging. When he might have been out in something.
I did not hear any. I've not ever heard about anything about Koresh jogging.
Well, thank you very much. And again, my time is about to expire, and all members want to ask questions. Again, I want to applaud you on your willingness to accept responsibility here, even as we gather it was not your responsibility to accept, but you did it anyway. But we will, and I applaud the committee for trying to get to the bottom of exactly what did you want, what could be approached for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mazzoli, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I hope when you come back, General Reno, that it's in a little bit more advantageous circumstances than this one. I have a few questions relative to the chain of command and decision-making process. The first is after you assumed office, were you briefed every day on the Waco situation?
Not every day.
But frequently enough on developments?
Frequently, and if there were any changes or any new developments.
Yeah. By whom were you briefed?
I would be briefed by Director Sessions upon occasion and by Mark Richard in my office. Those were the two primary, and people who would be with Director Sessions.
At any time prior to Saturday, April 17th, which was 2 days before the fire broke out, did you discuss this matter with the President?
No, I did not.
When was the first time you discussed the matter with President Clinton?
Sunday.
And at that time, did you brief him about what the FBI's plan was and seek his reaction?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what was his reaction?
He supported my decision.
When was the first time after the fire broke out that you talked to President Clinton about what happened?
That night late.
You appeared on Tom Brokaw's program, which I had hoped to see, but I had already fallen asleep at 11:30 at night on that. And at that time, Mr. Brokaw asked you 10 hours after the fact if you had discussed the matter with President Clinton. You said that you didn't, and in a part of that interview, you said you were going to talk to the President after you got off the air. Is that when you had your first conversation with him?
I don't remember the exact time when I got off the air because I was then subsequently responding to further inquiries from the media and felt that it was important, since I knew the President had been briefed as to what had happened, to try to respond to the American people and be accountable to them, since I considered it my decision.
During the Brokaw interview, you said that the President was talking with Webster Hubbell about what had happened in Waco and the events leading up to that. Could you tell us what you found out about that conversation between the President and Mr. Hubbell?
What I think I did, and that may be subject to correction, because when I think what I told Mr. Brokaw was that Webster Hubbell had been the person discussing the issues with the White House. I had talked with the President that morning, and I had forgotten during the course of that afternoon and all that had happened that before the fire broke out, I'd given him an update. Hubbell was talking to the White House that afternoon and into the evening. What I thought I corrected myself with Brokaw was to say I don't know whether Hubbell had talked directly with the President or with somebody in the White House counsel's office.
Yeah. Do you know if Hubbell ever went to the scene of the siege outside of Waco after it started?
No, he did not.
Okay, so he did not go there. It's not that you don't know.
He did not go there.
Yeah, what was Mr. Hubbell's role in this? The concern that I am having is that there has not been direct communication between you as head of the Justice Department, who has got the ultimate responsibility, as you have accepted, for the activities of the agencies, your department, and the President, that somehow Mr. Hubbell was in the loop, and I think it would be very instructive for us to know exactly where in the loop he was.
Mr. Hubbell is the Associate Attorney General designate, and he was talking with the White House counsel's office. I had talked to the White House counsel's office, and that was how he was in the loop.
Yeah.
I was the person that briefed the President on the Sunday before it happened as to what the plan of action was, and he supported it. I talked to him that night after it happened. I've talked to him on several occasions since then, and he has been very supportive.
But from what you said to Mr. Brokaw, is that apparently Mr. Hubbell was talking to the President before you were able to talk to the President after the fire broke out and the people perished. And I'm trying to find out what Mr. Hubbell's role was in all of this. He's not been confirmed by the Senator sworn in. He has been designated, but he still isn't doing that job.
As I indicated, I think I corrected myself, or at some point during the course of the evening corrected myself when I realized that I knew that he had been talking to the White House. I don't know whether he talked directly to the President. I made a point of talking directly to the President. He had been fully briefed, understood what had happened, and we have continued to talk.
Did he play any role in your approval process of the breaking up of the siege in Waco?
Yes, sir. I talked to him the Sunday before, on April the 18th, and explained to him what we proposed to do, and he approved.
Was he briefed by the FBI on what the options were independently of you?
No, he was not.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hughes, the gentleman from New Jersey.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this very timely hearing, and welcome, General. Let me just say that, like my colleague from New York, I think most of us are very happy that you are the Attorney General of the United States. You take the kind of compassion and toughness and savvy and experience to that office that we need, and you're like a breath of fresh air, and we wish you well. We're happy the President supported you wholeheartedly when you offered to resign. I'm concerned about a couple areas. My colleague Henry Hyde has already touched on one area. Since Talladega, some 18 months or so ago, we realized that we have one hostage rescue team, and fatigue should never be a factor in our decision making. And I hope that we'll look at what we need to do to provide the resources so that we don't have that as a factor in our decision as to when to move in a law enforcement operation. Let me focus instead more directly on who we consulted. I understand you've indicated that the FBI will testify as to who they consulted by way of behavioral experts. You testified that you did talk to Dr. Harry Salem relative to tear gas and his expertise. Did you ever talk to any of the folks from the American Family Association that has developed quite a bit of experts, or the Cult Awareness Network possibly during this time?
I personally did not, sir.
Do you know whether the FBI did?
I have not heard of that, of the American Family Association, but I'm not sure that that's...
Family Foundation.
I think the American Family Association and the American Family Foundation are separate.
They are, and the foundation is what I'm referring to.
And I have not talked to them.
Well, the American Family Foundation has developed a great deal of expertise, as you may know. Are you familiar with the article that appeared recently, in fact, April 20th, on how many Jonestowns will it take?
I have a copy of that article. I'm trying to collect as much information as I can to pass on both to the investigators from within the department and independent investigators so that we make sure that anything such as this is fully considered in trying to develop guidelines, processes, and policies for addressing these issues in the future. And also, as Congressman Edwards points out, for addressing non-cult situations that might develop in the same fashion.
See, one of my main concerns, and I've corresponded, as you know, with your department before you became Attorney General, over the lack of information, strategic information in particular, about cults around the country. We don't even know how many we have. And while the CIA apparently many years ago did some in-depth studies on mind control, we've done very little apparently. And I realize there are some very serious First Amendment questions involved, but it seems to me that we cannot deal with situations like this without a lot more information. One of the constructive suggestions I've received from those that are working with the Cult Awareness Network, and I've been in touch with them for a number of months, is that we don't know how to deal with people like David Koresh or Vernon Howes in these types of situations, because it's not like the usual hostage situation. And I would hope that we try to develop that kind of expertise in the future. And I'm not faulting, basically any agency, because I understand, the difficulties that we have to be careful about with regard to freedom of religion in particular.
As you know, Congressman, we met, and I am following up on some of your suggestions and doing everything I can to make sure that we determine all available experts that can advise us in terms of how we address these problems in the future. What do we do now to address the cults that exist? What action should be taken, if any? We want to do a very careful review.
See, I don't know that it would have made any difference no matter what we would have done. David Koresh is responsible for what happened. I don't buy the suggestions of my colleagues that the law enforcement communities should be criticized. I don't agree with the suggestions I've heard that the search warrant needs to be examined very carefully in the complaint that was filed. Frankly, I read it last evening, and there was more than enough evidence for to issue both the search warrant and the warrant, in my judgment, and I'm sure most of my colleagues will agree with that assessment. I mean, the issue is, frankly, what we can do to provide more information, basically, so that we can make better decisions to avert what occurred. I'm going to have some questions of ATF about the options that we were presented with. I gather the FBI was not in the loop when you made the decision on April the 19th. Had the FBI been consulted at that time on the plan that was developed?
The FBI?
The FBI. February 19th, yeah. February 19th.
February 28th.
28th.
Okay.
Sorry. The day that you made the decision to go ahead with one particular plan after weighing options.
I would have to refer you to the FBI on that. Again, I focused on what happened as existed on the date that I took office and what I had been briefed on in terms of the department's responsibilities, including the FBI.
Okay, so you're not sure at this point whether the FBI was consulted.
No, I think to be
as
accurate,
the plan evolved. Did you ever look at an option that would do as Mr. Mazzoli has suggested, basically attempt to get David Koresh when he was outside the compound?
I asked them if there were any situations where we thought we could get them out and isolate them, and based on the information they furnished to me, that was not going to be possible.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I just hope that we don't rush to judgment. You know, I hear suggestions that we should basically realign ATF, and there are some difficulties there because they have regulatory responsibilities that don't lend themselves to law enforcement missions. But I hope that out of this will come an examination of what occurred, of the structure, of the mission, command and control, and see if we can do it perhaps better next time. And that's not leveling any criticism at anybody, because frankly, I believe that David Koresh is the one that was responsible for the death of the children and the adults that died in that compound.
I want to join you in that effort.
Judgment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hughes. Mr. Geekus, the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I thank the chair, and I join in the welcome that has been proffered to the Attorney General to these proceedings. Many of us on this panel, as you've probably discerned by now, are former prosecutors, and we have a kind of a feel for the process that was undertaken from beginning to end, because part of the responsibility in a criminal action is to prepare for the eventual court proceeding and final process in the justice system that we have. In that regard, I wanted to focus on something. When you came on board as Attorney General was sworn in, who was the U.S. Attorney in the Waco area? My information is that that was the Western District of Texas. Is that correct?
Mr. Ederer.
Yes. And our information also, as you can confirm, is that he was instrumental in the preparation of the search warrant and the affidavits and the consultations with the judge in that in this case. Is that correct?
I don't know, sir.
You don't know that?
I don't know whether he was personally instrumental or not.
Well, when you issued your order to, or directive or announcement about dismissing or asking for the resignations of U.S. attorneys, did that include Mr. Lederer?
What we did when we asked for the resignation of U.S. attorneys was to take each case on a case-by-case basis to make sure that there was an orderly transition and that nothing was impacted. One of the first questions that I raised was the issue of Waco to make sure that there was an orderly transition.
Was that based on the severity of the case or the importance to the public of the case? There were criteria apparently that you utilized in asking him to stay on?
The criteria that I utilized in each instance was to make sure that there was no interruption in ongoing matters that would be affected by a U.S. attorney leaving if there was going to be an interim U.S. attorney appointed. Subsequently, concern was expressed by people at the scene. I sent Mark Richards from the Criminal Division to Waco to personally meet with everybody concerned to make sure that we had the best prosecution presence available on the scene to properly handle the matter.
So the reports you got back from Mr. Richards was to the effect that he should be requested to stay on, or that he could stay on. Is that it?
What we discussed with Mr. Richards, and he is here and can go into more detail, was we reviewed it to see what experienced prosecutor should be assigned on the trial prosecutor who would actually handle it, who had had extensive experience. The recommendation of the Criminal Division was that that would be Mr. Ray Yan. I believe the last name is spelled J-A-H-N, who had had extensive experience, as I recall, in the prosecution of a case involving the murder of a federal judge. Based on all the conclusions, everybody's discussions with the FBI, with local prosecutors, with people on the scene, Mr. Richards met with Mr. Ederer and people on the scene. We determined that Mr. Ray Yan would be the person that would lead the prosecution at the scene.
In Mr. Lederer's jurisdiction, you're saying?
Yes, Mr. Yan, as I understand it, was an assistant United States attorney in Mr. Lederer's office.
And Mr. Lederer would be staying on?
That was going to be addressed as we went along, but we felt very comfortable with Mr. Yan being on the scene and being the person directly involved in the prosecution of the case.
Was Mr. Lederer relieved during that time? I mean, was he not supposed to focus on this incident while Mr. Yan was doing his?
Mr. Yan was going to be the person directly on the scene, handling it directly, coordinating with the Texas Rangers, with local prosecutors, with everybody involved on the scene, since Waco was somewhat removed from San Antonio.
So if a new search warrant or other affidavit or other legal process would have to be confronted at the initial stage, it would have been presented by the FBI or ATF to Mr. Yan at that time, or
to Mr. Yan and the person who had been at the scene, whose name, as I recall, is David Johnson, or Johnston, who was the assistant United States attorney on the scene. Which prosecutor personally handled the search warrant, I'd have to refer you to ATF, and we will be happy to furnish you with the information as to who assisted in the original search warrant from the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Is Mr. Lederer still on duty?
It's Ederer, as I recall, E-D-E-R-E-R.
Oh, Ederer.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
E-D-E-R-E-R,
yes.
as I recall.
Is he? I guess I didn't catch. Maybe I didn't ask it correctly. Is he still now the U.S. attorney for that district?
I don't know. I'd be happy to furnish you that information to see whether he has resigned at this point or not.
On another quick matter,
I'm told that he is still there.
Just to follow up, to conclude that portion of it, when the decision was made that his resignation should not be requested, I take it, you can confirm it one way or another, that part of the reason that he was not asked to resign, in your general conclusion about the transition which you described, the importance of the case, the public attention to which had been drawn to it, and the general circumstances of the high visibility of that case. Is that correct?
That would be one of the factors, sir.
I have no further questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sinor, the General from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Ms. Reno. Let me focus in on the tough decision you eventually had to make. In making that decision, was there any additional information you either wanted or needed that you did not have available to you at the time of the decision?
I asked question after question, Congressman, about the circumstances of the children, about anything that I could think of, and trying to elicit as much information as I could to make sure that we had fully explored everything. And I don't recall being told we can't furnish you this information. I mean, each question where I was told, no, we can't do that, was based on a technological impossibility.
In making your decision, what influence did the death of the 4 agents have in that decision?
The decision of the death of the 4 agents and the injury to the 15 or 16 other agents created the situation in the first place of a dangerous offender who knowingly had killed federal agents, who had knowingly injured federal agents, who was dangerous, armed with very, very high-powered weapons. And all of those factors created the situation in which I was faced with a situation that I couldn't say, here, put down the guns, we'll walk away from this, or here, we'll put down the guns and let Koresh come out and talk to us. Here was a person who had murdered, and obviously that was a significant factor.
What influence did the nature and amount of weapons within the arsenal have on your decision?
That had a real impact because I learned a lot more about weapons. At first, when I asked why we needed an HRT or hostage rescue team to try to ensure the security of the perimeter, I was surprised when they said, well, we're going to have to pull back at some point. if we aren't able to resolve this, because they're the only ones that can really secure the perimeter. And I said, well, why not a SWAT team or bring in other agencies? And then they just started describing just how far a 50 caliber weapon or ammunition can travel, and started putting it in terms of from here to the White House. And I even questioned that. And they said, well, its effective range is 3,000 yards, and an intentional killing range where they have a real chance of success is 1,000 a mile. And as I put those into perspective, just looking at Washington areas, that was another factor. The powder that they obviously had in the place, the degree that they had armed themselves, the fact that they had built additional gun holes and portholes from which to fire these weapons was certainly a factor, because I was concerned with the life of FBI agents on the scene. I was concerned with people who might wander into the compound area and institute or just initiate through accidental or other means a confrontation with them. There were so many factors that had to be considered because these people were armed and extremely dangerous.
What influence did the resources being expended have on the decision?
That's the one factor that people kept mentioning that I tried not to address, because I don't think that you can address the exposure of, the danger of exposing human life. It was expensive, but I just very early on put that in the background and said, I can't consider that when I have the lives of the children at stake.
And the length of time that the agents had been on site, how did that influence your decision?
That influenced my decision in the sense that I was told, the first I heard about it was by Delta Force, and I had not yet had the chance to meet with the head of the hostage rescue team, but he was there the same day, and both pointed out that the state of readiness of the HRT would be diminished if they were required to stay on the scene much longer, that they could pull back. But at the same time, the compound was arming itself with gun holes and taking other precautions, and I made the decision that no time was perfect, but that at this point we should increase the pressure with our expectation that it would that it might not go down that day. The next day we might not get everybody out for 3 days. There might be a bunker where they could go, but that we should increase the pressure to try to get them out in a peaceful, safe manner.
And finally, at any time during your decision process, did you feel like you had inadequate personnel, equipment, strategy, or resources to make the decisions necessary?
No. Every time I turned around, the Bureau was here. We asked for the Delta Force, and much to my, I thought I'd be talking to them on the telephone. Much to my amazement, there they were at the FBI, both the former commander and the present commander. Here was the hostage rescue team leader. Here was the doctor. The questions I had trying to probe, they always came through and tried to provide me with as much information as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steinhardt. Mr. Coble, North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Reno, it's good to have you here. Ms. Reno, let me think aloud with you for a minute or two and propound a series of statements and/or questions to you, then I'll be glad to hear from you. On February 28th, it appears that the element of surprise had been compromised, perhaps even emasculated, and I'm wondering why at that time the raid was not aborted and delayed until a subsequent time. Number two, many complaints have been voiced because the invasion of the compound occurred too soon. You yourself, I think, in your testimony said, why now? Why not wait? Let me put another spin on it, Ms. Reno, and ask if anyone considered conversely accelerating the operation. I'm thinking now fiscally, and I realize it's very delicate because you have innocent people inside that compound, but I know the daily cost was enormous. I am told in excess of $1 million, and after the fact, the result may have been even better to have done that. Admittedly, Ms. Reno, every one of us at this panel up here is applying 20/20 hindsight today, and that's far easier, I will stipulate, than was what confronted these agents when they were in the trenches. But having said all that, it appears probably about every person who touched the ball presumably fumbled it at one time or another. Again, that's easy for us to say today. But I don't want these hearings to conclude, Mr. Chairman, without at least mentioning, and this has been said before, I think the most crucial fumble of all must be charged against David Koresh. After all, it was he who started this in motion. He cannot, in my opinion, be exonerated and should not be exonerated, which leads me to this question, Ms. Reno. I guess when you're dealing with what appeared to be a prominent presence of emotional and or mental instability inside the walls of that compound, at that point, perhaps a higher degree of care should have been imposed, and I'm curious to know if you believe that was done. I don't believe it has been asked yet at this stage of the hearing whether or not, Ms. Reno, you and or Director Sessions ever went to Waco. I'd be curious to know about that, and if you did not, I'd like to know why not.
With respect to you...
Let me ask one more, a couple more, Ms. Reno. If I were drafting a plan for subsequent use, hopefully we'll never have Waco 2, but if I were drafting a plan to be used, I believe I would insert therein provisions for a more thorough, continuous briefing for the President. It appears, and I may be wrong, but it appears that the President was in the anteroom rather than at the head of the table. And I'm thinking if he's a former governor, he was a chief executive at Arkansas, who knows, he may have had a similar encounter while there. I'm wondering if that was ever discussed. And finally, in response, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Fish, asked you, Ms. Reno, concerning psychological warfare. And I think it's clear that that was a key component in Waco. And I'm curious to know if you approved of the use of psychological warfare against the Branch Davidian compound. I apologize, Ms. Reno, for hitting in rapid-fire succession, but these are questions that have plagued me almost since the outset. And if you can respond in the time that's left, I will be appreciative.
First of all, your first question, as I understand it, is why, after it appeared that the ATF assault had been compromised, was it not delayed? And I would have to refer you to the ATF for that. That is in another department.
That's fine.
Secondly, you made reference to a complaint, the complaints that we went in too soon. Again, I've spelled out why we took the time we did to try to exhaust negotiation techniques and to do everything we could to try to resolve it peacefully. We did not go in the sense of an armed assault. We went in by trying to increase the pressure through the use of gas. Your third question was, on the other side of the coin, why didn't we physically assault the place at the beginning? Based on the firepower that was in that building, I did not think, based on what the Bureau told me, and it was certainly their conclusion, that they could assault that place physically while at the same time ensuring the safety of the agents involved and ensuring the safety of the innocent children inside. Third, your fourth question is, you made a reference to a higher degree of care.
I was going to say, when you're dealing with emotional and mental instability, maybe, you know, some people are prone to say, well, my gosh, they're just a bunch of nuts and let's go in and take over. I think maybe we ought to do it in a more delicate, careful manner. Say, listen, we've got a problem in here. We're not quite sure what the response is going to be. Do you think that at that point they said, let's be especially more careful? That was my question.
I think the FBI approached it with the greatest care imaginable. On February 28th, they went in to Waco but they didn't go into that compound. They didn't assault it. They very carefully started talking to people. As you hear from them today, they will tell you who they talked to, the care they went to, everything they did to try to effect in the most thoughtful manner possible a proper resolution of it. You ask why I don't know whether Director Sessions went to Waco, but whether I went to Waco, I did not go to Waco. I'm not an expert in hostage negotiation. I'm the person where the buck stops. I'm not an expert in terms of law enforcement tactics. And the Bureau frankly told me, when we get into a tactical situation, that's our job. And I acknowledge that. But at the same time, the buck stops with me in terms of a review of, if they had said, well, we're going to go do something crazy, I would have said, no, you're not. If they had said, we're going to do something that didn't make any sense, I would ask them questions until it made sense. But as I asked question after question of the Bureau, their responses made sense. And nothing that I was going to learn on the ground at Waco that I didn't see from picture after picture, from reviewing the models of the compound, from understanding everything, from understanding where every water tank was, the bunkers were, where the armament was expected to be. It was not a decision made overnight. The first time this question of using the gas came up was during the week of April the 5th. There was meeting after meeting in terms of reviewing it, asking the questions, saying, go get more information, go do this, check this out, let us talk with the Delta Force people. What about the water tanks? Question after question. Whether, if upon our investigation, if upon the recommendation of all involved, all of us who want to make sure that this tragedy or a tragedy like this does not recur again, they say we can do something with greater care, I'm going to be the first to try to do it. But I do know that extraordinary care, extraordinary deliberation went into this.
Ms. Reno, I think if the chairman is uneasy about a red light, I'll be glad to hear from you, but I suspect, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield whatever you say on that.
Have you completed your...
Well,
he's got two more questions.
Ms. Reno, would you approve of the plan that I drafted to bring the President from the anteroom to the head of the table if he, in fact, was in the anteroom? It appeared that he was not continuously brought up to speed on this, and I'm not saying this critically, but that seems to be my gut feeling.
I guess it's the difference between President Roosevelt and General Marshall and General Eisenhower and General Bradley. And I think that President Clinton did exactly what President Roosevelt did during World War II, and I was in kind of the position of General Marshall. And he got briefed, and he took responsibility, and he's been supportive, and it was my decision, and I take responsibility.
So I don't think you would sign off on my plan for Waco too, and I say that with tongue in cheek.
I would not sign off on your plan to send the President of the United States into all the details that have to be made, because as I was making decisions there, I was also dealing with Los Angeles and making other decisions, and there are an awful lot of issues that have to be dealt with in the country. But the President has been supportive of me. He was informed. He was concerned because he had a situation in Arkansas, and he had considerable thought, and he had the right questions.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the additional time. Ms. Reno, I thank you for your response.
Thank you very much. Ms. Pat Schroeder, gentlewoman from Colorado.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me say, this is a very historic day, and I am very happy to have General Reno here appearing as our first woman Attorney General. I also think it's historic in that you've spent more time now as an Attorney General in front of this committee than I can remember since I've been on the committee, even though this is your first appearance. So let me say, even though we're all saddened that your first appearance had to be on this topic, you've raised the responsibility and the accountability of public service to an incredibly high level that we have never seen before in this committee, and I salute you for that. One of the things that has been talked about so much is your concern about the children, and I think you've made that point very, very well. My understanding is there are no studies or very few studies is what you do about children in a cult situation, because the normal things you do in a hostage situation is use family members, but these are people who've already turned their back on the family members. So as much as family members hoped they'd be listened to, they've said no. They've also given up all their possessions at home and so forth, and so they've really made a determination to put their life under the control of the cult leader. And therefore, the normal hostage things do not work. Are you aware of any studies that we don't know about in this area?
Since April the 19th, a number of people have come forward with different ideas, and we're trying to work through all of those, reach out to as many people as might claim to have some expertise in how to deal with this complicated situation, and try to explore it as openly as possible, recognizing that this is a discipline and an area of study that is a very murky one, and that there is much that perhaps we can learn.
I noticed that there was, in one of the California papers, some of the law enforcement officers who had had child abuse things filed against David Koresh, talking about how impossible it was to pursue the charges, because what was happening was parents would give their children up for sex with Mr. Koresh on the basis that they would then this would be their entree to heaven. And they said the children couldn't even really talk to them because they thought they were having sex with someone who was of a higher being than themselves. So the whole child abuse thing collapsed. I think that gets to the next thing that I hear from my constituents and from Americans. After we learned about the man in New Jersey and all of his INS problems and how he was still there looking at the whole World Trade Center. And then we see David Koresh, and we've seen countries such as Australia had filings against them way back in '87. INS had all sorts of material to move on him. There are the child abuse statements from different states and so forth. You wonder how many more of these cases are out there that we haven't acted on. I mean, I think the average American also wonders how many of these multiple violations, whether it's INS or whether it's weapons or child abuse or whatever, what else is out there, and why is there such hesitation to act on these cases? Is it that we don't know what the answer is and we don't know where we're going, or is law enforcement just so overburdened that you can't get to everything?
Well, first of all, I can't respond to the prior complaints against Koresh in other jurisdictions as to whether they had sufficient evidence or what the issues are. I can respond after 15 years as a prosecutor in Dade County to tell you that there's an awful lot of crime out there that law enforcement tries its best to pursue, and because of problems of proof, and particularly where you have small children or children in certain situations, it's one of the most difficult prosecutions to undertake. In Dade County, my office was able to successfully prosecute a man who had sexually abused some 20 children between the ages of 3 and 7, and it was an extraordinarily complicated prosecution. At the same time, I get criticized by some people saying, you know, you overreact to those situations. We don't overreact. We try to operate based on the evidence and the law. And all of these, it just requires, and what I hope to establish is a real partnership with local law enforcement, where we use the limited resources of federal, state, and local law enforcement officials, prosecutors, to develop priorities, to focus on crimes of violence and crimes that tear the fabric of our children apart, and use our resources the best way we can to see that the violent people, the dangerous people, are put away and kept away. With respect to David Koresh, after the fact, you know, after the FBI came in, when I took office, the Bureau was trying to negotiate, and I supported them in that situation, though I felt that the children were in jeopardy because I was balancing all the conflicting interests that we had and the potential that they might be injured by more aggressive action on our part.
With your 2020 vision, we're all sitting here taking shots at you. With 2020 vision, is there anything that you can think of that we might have done differently? Were there any alternatives to gas, which is a passive way of pulling people out? Or is there differences in the chain of command or anything you could see that would have been helpful?
The only thing that I can think, the only alternatives after I excluded one by one was to wait it out. And to take to pull back the HRT, take the chance with a less expert group to try to control the perimeter, bring the HRT back in, wait it out. And when I countered there was the danger of the man, the inability to secure it, the potential for people being endangered, I made the best judgment I could. What I am looking to, what I want to, and I've had conversations with Congressman Hughes and with others, I don't know whether they're experts, because I read this article with great interest when it came out, both articles. And you look at it, and then you look at some of the information, and you think, well, if they had known this, what would they say? That's what I want to do, just see if we can perhaps develop a cadre of real experts that have information about how to deal with cults or certain types of cults, or have information as to how on issues Congressman Edwards spoke of, where there's no cult involved, but there's an organized resistance. What we can do, because I think we're going to see it again. And I, for one, don't want to be back here when somebody asks me, don't you remember the lessons of Waco?
I don't have any time, but it's...
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the gentlewoman proceed for 30 seconds, and if she would yield to me just, because you touched on a very important point. And yesterday, our committee had a hearing on the question of immigration and asylum and the question of abuse of those laws, which in fact involved Koresh to some extent, certainly that fellow Kanzi and Sheikh Rahman. I would only say that we are on that trail of trying to do something with the laws to make sure they're less likely to be abused, but also we desperately need a permanent immigration service commissioner. And I mentioned to General Reno when I visited with you last Thursday at your reception, Ms. Sale does an excellent job, and if she's your choice, terrific. She did a great job yesterday, but somebody needs to be in that spot.
One of the first things yesterday, Congressman, I got your message, and as I told you at the reception, immigration, I think, is one of the most important subjects that I will address as Attorney General. I want to make sure that I choose the best person possible, and I will not unduly delay it, because I want somebody to.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lamar Smith, the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Reno, I'd like to focus a little bit more on the decision-making process. Who made the final decisions, how they were made, with the goal of learning lessons for the future. And in regard to that decision-making process, just to review a little bit, it's my understanding that you first briefed President Clinton Saturday night about 7:30 on what the options were in regard to your plan for ending the siege. Is that correct?
No, I did not talk to President Clinton until Sunday.
Okay. When did you talk to President Clinton on Sunday?
I don't know what time, sir.
And at that, it was morning or afternoon or evening?
I think it was probably afternoon, but I don't have a specific recollection.
And it was at that point that you presented him with the options that you had considered for ending the siege?
I presented him, but he was already familiar with the options of waiting it out. The two options I saw were of waiting it out or going in with the gas. That I had in my exploration not come up with any other non-lethal means of trying to resolve it.
Did he express a preference for either one of those options?
He said that he supported my decision to go forward with the trying to increase the pressure by using the tear gas.
Okay. You said repeatedly during your testimony that whenever you were presented with options, you continuously questioned those options. Did the President question either of the two options that you presented to him?
He didn't raise any questions with me except to make sure that I had fully explored it. He said, have you gotten all your questions answered?
And at that point, you felt that he was approving your recommendation of the option to go in and end the siege. Is that correct?
No, he was approving my option, which I saw as the option to use gas to try to increase the pressure to get them to come out.
And he approved that option that you mentioned to him?
Yes.
Okay, and it was at that point, Sunday, that he approved that option. Did he express an interest to be continuously briefed on the events in Waco, within the compound?
We had been told by the White House to keep the White House posted. I don't recall this president specifically asking that, but he then called the next morning before the fire broke out, and we brought him up to date.
Okay. In regard to your conversations with President Clinton, you talked to him last before the assault on this Sunday when he approved the option that you just mentioned. Is that correct?
I talked to him on Sunday, and I talked to him on Monday morning, and I talked to him Monday night. And
you talked to him Monday morning before 6 a.m. in the morning when the siege began? You talked to him Monday morning after the siege began?
That's correct.
At about what time was that?
About 11 o'clock.
And at that point, you told him that presumably all lives were lost?
No. This was before the fire.
This was on Sunday morning, excuse me. Okay.
No, sir. I talked to him Sunday morning, or no, Sunday, I think it was Sunday afternoon, and told him, discussed briefly with him what the options were, what we had done to explore the variety of options, the fact that I had asked questions and that I felt that we should go forward. The siege began, I mean, we started to gas at 7 o'clock our time, and I talked to him about 11 o'clock Monday morning before the fire broke out.
Before the fire broke out, okay. At that point, that was the last time you spoke to the President until when? Later that evening?
That's correct.
And were you, during the course of the day, communicating with the President through an intermediary?
Yes.
And who were you directly speaking to who spoke directly to the President?
I don't know that I spoke to anybody who spoke directly to the President. I was speaking with Webb Hubbell. Webb Hubbell was talking to the White House counsel's office, and they were keeping the President advised.
So the President was basically getting his information second or third hand at that point, and through an individual who had not yet been sworn in or received Senate approval. Is that correct?
I don't know who he was directly getting it from. Webb Hubbell was the Associate Attorney General designate, and he had not been sworn in.
When was the President informed that it was likely that all lives were lost, including the 24 children, and it looked like it was going to be a fiasco?
When I talked to him that night, we still had not been able to have any determination of whether there were the possibility of people surviving. So it was probably the next day that he was told, and I don't have a recollection of the specific sequence when it seemed that we were exhausting all hope that anybody could be alive.
And at what point did the fire break out?
Fire broke out at approximately 11:42.
Something like that. It seems to me
they
that
have the precise chronology, and I get mixed up. Right. So let the FBI furnish you with the specific information based on what we perceived from the Night Stalker.
Right. Within an hour or two after the fire first broke out, because of the wind and because of what looked like a complete conflagration of the structures and the entire compound, most of the media were saying at that point it would be hard to believe that there would be any lives that would be spared from the fire. Presumably the President was kept informed as to all this. Why is it that he did not feel the need, or that you did not feel the need, to communicate directly when it looked like you were getting a result that you neither wanted nor expected?
We made sure that the White House was advised and knew what was happening, and we were talking with people to see that everything that was done in terms of trying to locate people.
I know
an agent went down. Agents risked their lives to go down into a bus that we knew was located right almost immediately adjacent to the compound where we were told that they might put children. We found that the bus was cool enough for people to have survived. We continued to try, and other agents, I think, risked their lives to try to see if there was any possibility that the children or others might be alive.
Right.
Again, the Bureau may be able to give you more specific information on what they did.
Yeah. It seems to me you say that the President was advised about the result that no one wanted or expected. It just seems to me that either the President or you would have been concerned enough, disappointed enough, outraged enough to have communicated directly, and I'm disappointed that there wasn't more communication between you and the President, more direct communication on something that is a fiasco on the scale that this is, for the President to simply be advised of the unexpected and unwanted result. Just seems to me to be disappointing and really not adequate. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman, the President's and my ultimate responsibility is to the American people. I knew the President of the United States knew what happened. I knew that I owed the people of the United States an explanation. I went through all the details to make sure that I could inform them as clearly as possible, and I tried to inform the people of the United States in a responsible fashion so that they would have answers to the question, since I knew the President was advised.
I appreciate all that, but what I'm saying is if you had time for all the news conferences and all the media interviews, certainly you had time and the President had time for you all to talk. That's my only point.
Since I knew that he was fully advised, and since I knew that the people of America had questions, I felt that I should respond to their questions.
Right.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dan Glickman, the gentleman from Kansas.
With all due respect to my colleague from Texas, Mr. Smith, I think he's off the wall. I think that I'm extremely impressed with your acceptance of responsibility, your honesty, your willingness to make changes, your depoliticization of this issue, and I think you've handled it splendidly. You've been in this job since March the 12th. You came in 2 weeks after the raid occurred. You had 16 trillion other problems that affect people's lives, street crime, drugs, everything else under the sun. So I'm going to accept what you're saying as the moral imperative of looking into the future and figuring out how we can keep these things from happening again. Let me just finish.
Use my name. I'd like to respond.
I'd give you 10 seconds.
Okay. If you were the Attorney General, wouldn't you think it important enough to talk to the President himself after this kind of a disaster?
I repeat, I think General Reno handled this satisfactorily, and I have no objections to the way that she handled it. Now, I want to go on with the issue. Do you believe you're the nation's chief law enforcement officer? I mean, that may be a rhetorical question, but do you see yourself in that role?
I've always wondered about that because I'm characterized as that on a regular basis. In Miami, I was always characterized as the chief law enforcement officer in Miami. But somebody who has the responsibility as a prosecutor has, in effect, a quasi-judicial responsibility as well. I'm also the legal advisor to the people of the United States, if you will. So there probably are a number of hats that the Constitution and Congress have put on my head.
Well, one of the reasons I ask this question is as I go back and look at, for example, the issues leading up to the raid on February late 28th, I guess it was, which I think is the key date here, it appears that we had one agency of government, largely a regulatory agency, an agency that regulated cigarette taxes and stamps on guns, with some law enforcement functions, engaging in a massive raid, a company-size raid, 100 people, to serve a warrant and to do what you call law enforcement functions. Then as I look at the material which provided the authority for the judge to issue the warrant, and they go back through the history of David Koresh, there's no mention of contact with other law enforcement agencies, the FBI, the Justice Department. And yet we had a situation, we sent in 100 federal law enforcement officers, 100, to try to get some guns out to serve and other objectives that I'm not sure about, and the ATF is here, and they will be able to answer that. And yet there's no relationship with the chief law enforcement officer of the United States of America. Now, that I think is something that cries out for a legislative recommendation from you as you look through this thing in terms of, in this modern era where we have guns beyond imagination in numbers, where we have terrorism, where we have cults, that there's got to be some review on how these organizations are structured and who's responsible for them, who's in control. As I understand it, the BATF ultimately called in the FBI because the problem was of much greater magnitude than they anticipated. And I guess what worries me is that your agency, DOJ and the FBI, was not involved until this crisis occurred, and given the magnitude of it, it's of extreme concern to me. I don't know if you've given any thought to this. And you might also answer this question. You were confirmed, you became Attorney General on March the 12th. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Was the acting Attorney General, or are there records to show that the previous Attorney General was in communication with BATF on this case? Or, you know, when I say the Attorney General, the Criminal Division of the Justice Department?
Again, I have not gone through it in detail. Mr. Gerson was obviously well briefed on Waco because he, as acting Attorney General, briefed me. Remember that, and this is an assumption on my part, and we will provide the information to you, that the Department of Justice, through the United States Attorney's Office, was presumably involved in securing the warrant, but I will have to provide that information, or maybe ATF can provide it. And one of the issues that I'm happy to address are recommendations as to how better coordination or structure might avoid this problem for the future.
Yeah, because you see, if you have a confusion over turf, as I understand the statute, the ATF has the power to enforce federal firearms legislation, explosives, but so does the FBI. I don't know where the demarcation comes. Is it the magnitude of the case? Is it just discretionary? At some point, looks like somebody needs to be an arbiter or a referee in this process. That did not happen here. That is, the raid of February 28th was the critical point in my judgment. That set everything going where when you finally made a decision in good faith that you wanted to end this thing, the pre-existing condition already was there for violence. And given the inherent, crazed nature of the cult organizations, an explosive situation took place. So I would just urge you that I consider you the chief law enforcement officer of this country. Take the bull by the horns, I guess. I'm not real good at this stuff, but you know what I'm talking about. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, or you can take the ball and run with it too, as Mr. Scott said. Thank you for bailing me out of this thing. Do your best to make sure that these law enforcement agencies are properly organized for a violent society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Glickman. That was interesting. Mr. Steve Schiff, gentleman from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Attorney General, I first would like to say that I have the utmost respect for you in that in your position faced with a very difficult and a very dangerous set of circumstances, you put together all of the information that was possibly available to you and made a decision. And I think that that's the most we can ask and expect of public officials, regardless of political party or particular position. And I understand that it's easy to second guess now. I'm quite convinced, though, that if something had happened during this interim, especially to the children there in the compound from other causes, you would still be here being asked why you didn't move faster, I think. However, as you said a bit earlier, we are here to look to the future. We hope we don't have another situation, but to look at this one in terms of how things might be planned differently. And it's with that in mind that I have a couple of questions. The first is, with respect to your conclusion that Mr. Koresh did not intend to surrender, his attorneys, I believe, have been quoted as saying that he had inferred at least that after he completed a biblical translation that he did in fact intend to surrender. Are you familiar with that suggestion, and how did you rule that that was, or decide that that was not going to happen?
That's a good question, Congressman, because I said he's talking about when he finishes the 7 seals, he will come out. And we went back over the lies that he had told the FBI up till that point. When their Passover was finished, he would come out. And the FBI felt that he had manipulated them and lied to them every step of the way. They can give you more of the details in terms of the notes and the information they had. Based on they also told me that based on their conversations and consultations with their behavioral scientists, that they concluded, and the scientists concluded, that he was a manipulator who would continue to manipulate. So again, if I had some point at which I could wait to in terms of some definite point where I might, through other circumstances such as the water supply or something like that, have concluded it with the hope of not finding the children or others in distress, I would have done so. But that's what entered into our deliberations there, and we did consider it.
At the other end of the situation, at the final end of this tragedy, it has been suggested in the media, again, I believe, by attorneys for Mr. Koresh and possibly by some members of the group who survived, that the actual deaths were caused by the government in that the government used tanks, knocked over lanterns, and that caused the fire, as opposed to any killings or suicides or intent for suicide that may have occurred. Have you received enough information to come to your own conclusion as to what happened at the end of that situation?
I don't want to judge prematurely, and I want to make sure that it's done in a thorough way. Based on all the information that's available to me, it is clear, based on that information to me, that the fires were set inside. But before we reach that judgment, since I have tried throughout to react based on solid facts, I'd like for that investigation to be fully complete and let the independent investigators speak to the subject.
Do you have any solid facts as to whether any individuals who died inside died as a result of gunshot wounds, or would you say that's still under investigation at this time?
I have been told very recently, and both this morning and yesterday, that that is the case. Again, so that there are no misrepresentations made or conclusions drawn, I would like for the medical examiners to make those statements themselves.
You referred to it briefly in your opening statement, but one of the arguments against the idea of a planned suicide was the fact that certain members from the compound were released earlier. If that occurred, wouldn't that indicate, how did you conclude that that did not indicate a concern for those individuals and other reasons?
If I understand your question correctly, it's why that the release of the earlier ones indicated that there might be a suicide of the remaining ones?
Why did it not indicate that people were going to come out? If some did come out and were allowed to come out, were not impeded by Mr. Koresh in coming out, why wouldn't that indicate to you that others might come out at a further time?
As I talked with the Bureau about that and said, what about the people that have come out? Don't we expect that we will get more out? My understanding is that a significant number had come out up till a certain point. Those were people that indicated to the Bureau that they were let out because Koresh couldn't control them, or that they wanted out, and he wanted people there subject to his control. Based on the number of people that had come out in the recent days before April the 19th, they had concluded that everybody was going to come out that could within the, or would within the foreseeable future.
Let me ask about one other area, if I may, and that is our colleague, Mr. Schumer, from New York, indicated he was going to introduce weapons or ammunition legislation. Have you come to the conclusion from these events that there ought to be more laws enacted with respect to arms or ammunition?
What I would like to do in respect to all of this matter is, again, review it carefully, not jump to conclusions, and present to you, after a careful review, my best judgment on such proposals.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Schiff. And the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Barney Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things that distresses me, obviously over and above the terrible, tragic loss of life here, first of the law enforcement agents and then of other people, is a tendency that I think is corrosive of our ability to govern, and that is a tendency to assume somehow, for purposes of criticism, that we can come up with solutions to problems that are somehow qualitatively more elegant than the problems themselves, that when you judge the proposed solutions, you can sort of ignore the inherent difficulties of the problem. So what I want to focus on is what your options were. Now, we have a separate set of questions we will be asking the BATF about the February 28th raid. And I think there are legitimate questions they should be addressing about whether there were alternative ways to try to arrest Mr. Koresh. Once he and his people had murdered law enforcement agents, as the Attorney General had said, this government had absolutely no option but to try to bring them into the law enforcement processes. It's unthinkable that people could murder law enforcement agents and that be ignored. So the questions I have are these. The options were, as I would understand it, waiting them out altogether. You've cited water supplies and other things that suggested that could have taken a very long time, and I want to salute the gentleman from New Mexico, who I think correctly noted that had you continued to delay and delay, and then had a fire broken out, or then had children been killed, many of the people criticizing you now for going in would have been equally vehement in their criticism of you for staying out. But my question is, were there third alternatives? I don't know. Did you have, because I think it is important if people are going to judge what the alternatives were. I will say that my own rule is anybody who wants to criticize that decision, for me, for that to have validity, I would like to see their proposal before the fact as to what would have happened. It seems to me we had this inherently difficult situation. But we had the option of simply trying to wait him out, which I agree with you sounds very unlikely. We had the option of doing what you're doing, and it does seem to me that you did learn very carefully, for instance, from the MOVE situation, that there were very clear efforts, and you did successfully avoid those dangers of what happened in Philadelphia. Were there additional options?
I explored the options. I even thought about, can't we tunnel under or something like that? The amount of explosives in the place would expose, I mean, that would be a horrible death for agents, many of whom were heroic in the course of all of this, and so I discounted that. A frontal assault, take in the Bradleys and the CEVs, I thought about that. I mean, children were going to get killed. I kept wishing that somebody would tell me that there was something that I could spray into the compound that would put everybody to sleep for 10 hours and we could go in and get them. And I was told that there was no technology that would permit that to happen.
Couldn't pipe in C-SPAN. Senate side.
What hindsight may tell us, but we will never, ever know, because there may have been no right answer in this. The only other possibility is different types of negotiation that might have been undertaken, and that we will explore.
Let me say, I tend to discount those particularly who suggested families. I don't think any of us are really cult experts. For one thing, the notion that there is a phenomenon called cults, which has a sufficient degree of similarity for you to make sort of hard and fast judgments, I'm skeptical of that. The cults are all very different. But one of the things that they do seem to have in common is that they don't get the family reunions much. I mean, as I think of cults, I don't think of familial get-togethers. It does seem to me that, from everything I've heard, one of the factors of cults is an isolation from the families. So it seems to me we had this situation and various forms of negotiations were tried. Either you continued to wait, knowing that people who had murdered federal agents heavily armed were inside and might do damage, or you tried a more lethal method of assault, or you tried what you did. I have tried to think of the options. If anyone else has some, I'd like to see what they are. In that case, I don't know what else you could have done. Let me ask one other question, and that is, if, and I know there's further evidence coming, but it does seem fairly clear so far that this fire was started deliberately by Mr. Koresh and the people under his direct command. If they were determined to do that, was there anything you could have done that would have avoided it? That is, was there any physical way, given the nature of that setup, for the federal law enforcement agencies to have prevented it? You couldn't have overflown aircraft with water. You've got people with accurate weapons to bring them down. So if, in fact, one accepts that he was tragically ready to do what he did at some moment, was there any physical way that could have been prevented?
Not to my knowledge, without exposing agents, a number of agents' lives to terrible danger.
Yeah. The last point I would like to say is that I regard the suggestion that the President should have been micromanaging this grader as something you ought to feel somewhat good about, because people who are eager to be critical, if that's all they can come up with, it seems to me they've made a mistake. And in fact, I think this is a clear case of the tendency for people to approach these as the psychological question, who do you like better, your mother or your father, to which there is no right answer. Had the President, in fact, been more deeply involved in the details, I have no doubt that many of those now critical would have been assailing him for interference. The effort to say that somehow it was a mistake for you not to have called the President immediately when the fire broke out baffles me. I have a great deal of respect for President Clinton, but instant firefighting is not one of the qualities to which I have ever been tempted to attribute to him. Thank you. Thank you.
The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Ramstad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Reno, I just want to say at the outset, you're a lot more than a breath of fresh air, but you're certainly that. I, too, have a great deal of respect for your candid, forthright responses to the questions, and I think pretty much the decision-making process here, questions as to that process have been exhaustive. I think you properly deferred to law enforcement experts and based your decision as pragmatically as possible upon the input you received from law enforcement, and I commend you for that process. I would like to focus, General, on whether law enforcement had adequate resources. I think there's a question that's been raised as to whether adequate resources exist. One of the two criteria upon which you based your decision to initiate the final raid was that there was only one hostage team and that they were fatigued, 50 members of that hostage team who had served so well, and that there was no backup or contingency. Now, is that to say that were there 2 federal hostage situations in the United States that we would not have another hostage team to handle the second?
What we would have been faced with if we'd had 2 teams so that I could pull one back, or not that's kind of certainly not but that we could have agreed that we would pull one back to let them get kind of retooled, if you will. It would have been dangerous to that team to send them into, I mean, if there had been a second situation, to send them in. What I would like to do is, rather than suggest what is absolutely necessary now, is move quickly to have a thorough assessment. Talking to neither the Bureau nor I are proud of, think we know it all. We've tried to do everything we could to focus on what the best way to do it. But anybody that has suggestions, international law enforcement officials or others, we'd like to make a recommendation to you after a very careful review as to what would be appropriate. The Bureau has made requests in past years, as I understand it, but I don't know that that request by itself would have averted this situation.
Well, as a member of the crime subcommittee, I look forward to working with you on that, because in a nation of 200 and some million people, it seems to me that perhaps we need to provide those resources for that contingency. The next question I'd like to ask is by way of foundation for a future witness, really as a follow-up to Mr. Moorhead's, but I believe this question is germane. Does the Department of Justice have a policy that prohibits media presence and advance notification at the execution of warrants or hostage situations?
I can't speak directly to what has been in existence in the Department of Justice, and I'm waiting to get my Deputy Attorney General confirmed before we review all our policies. But I can tell you what my policy was as State Attorney for the 11th Judicial Circuit, and that was I didn't want media there at the site.
So if I correctly understand your response, you're not certain as to present DOJ policy?
What has been DOJ policy, I know in the 2 questions that I've had when it's been posed to me, and it's come up not in relation to Waco, but in relation to 2 other situations, I've said no way.
Finally, General Reno, there's been much written by Monday morning quarterbacks as to your second criteria, that of your concern for the alleged child abuse that was ongoing. And there's been much written about the apparent discrepancies between your stated reason, that is the allegations of child abuse, and the Director of the FBI's statements that there was no contemporaneous evidence of abuse, rather that agents were relying on allegations made prior to the initial raid. I assume, in trying to give you a chance to explain this discrepancy about which there's been much discussion, headline stories like this one from the Washington Times dated April 22nd, 1993, I assume that you had contemporaneous evidence of child abuse, that you were not relying on allegations prior to the events of February 28th.
What I was told, there were 2 instances of child abuse. There was the historical child abuse, which I understood. Then I understood that people continued to come out with information, and I cannot pinpoint the date of when that child abuse occurred, but that children had been abused, both in terms of sexual abuse, which was ongoing. And I also understood in terms of children that were being beaten. I can't say that the beating occurred before February 28th, that it occurred on April the 18th or the 19th. The Bureau, when I kept asking, because I kept saying, you mean they were really beaten? And the Bureau said, that's what the reports are saying. The Bureau thought that it was continuing based, again, on their consultation with behavioral experts that said that there was no reason to believe that it wasn't ongoing. And so that is the information that they had furnished me. I assumed that there were reports, and it was a mistake on my part that I could pinpoint something that had happened afterwards. That was, I mean, after February 28th. I cannot tell you that a child was beaten after February 28th.
So you didn't have any specific allegations of child abuse from those children exiting the compound after February 28th? No specific allegations?
That's correct.
Well, I appreciate, again, your forthright, candid testimony, and look forward to working with you in the future to help law enforcement in these and other situations. Thank you.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Schumer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, let me say that I must strongly disagree with the comments of my colleague from Michigan, as much as I respect him personally. If there was a disgrace here, it was not with the Attorney General or with the FBI or with the ATF, in my opinion. The disgrace was that Koresh was allowed to accumulate all the weapons he did. The disgrace was that 28 children, he took 27 children with him. And I want to tell you, General Reno, that in your answer to that comment, I think, if anything, you increased our confidence in you. I have a couple of questions, and clearly this was not a casual decision. You elaborated on how much you went through it. The question that leaps out to the average person is why did all of the authorities, yourself included, appear so confident that there would not be a mass suicide when something formidable, such as a tank or whatever, came knocking at their door, given the fact that this was a messianic cult, that they believed in the Armageddon at some point on a more cosmic basis and might apply it to them, that it seemed to me Koresh, and this you knew far more about his personality profile than I did, but to the average person it would seem Koresh is not the type of person who would walk out of that compound in chains and face arrest or whatever charges he might meet. So I think the question that many people are asking is just a little more elaboration on why it seemed that when this started, that it was so unlikely that they would all involve themselves in some kind of mass suicide or mass destruction.
First of all, the Bureau had carefully increased the pressure by clearing away cars and other vehicles and debris and such that would block egress and ingress to the compound. And even at one point, the tank had kind of bumped into the building by mistake, or tank or the CEV. I, again, am not the expert on those vehicles, and they can tell you in detail. Even the day before, when they were removing cars from in front of the compound, and the FBI can give you the specific reference on it, my understanding is that Koresh didn't seem to be alarmed at all, even after the tank had bumped the building, and said, by the way, I guess it was a Camaro or something, watch out, that's a vintage Camaro, be sure you don't hurt it when you move it away, which didn't sound like a person who was going to be that concerned as the pressure increased. I went through it again carefully with the Bureau because as they had talked with people, talked with the lawyers, they can give you the details as they went through it with me, and better that they give it to you so that it's absolutely accurate as to why, although it was a possibility, and I want to stress that it was a possibility and something I factored in because I didn't, my other conclusion was that he wasn't going to come out and that he could do this at any time. So it was a possibility.
The next question is, when you were presented this plan, and I'm not talking about the options the way my colleague from Massachusetts weighed them out, et cetera, but were you presented specific options, maybe using this type of gas, maybe using some other method? Were there a variety of different options presented to you, specific options, once you made the decision that some proactive policy had to be done?
Again, neither the Bureau nor I looked at this as a proactive policy, if you will. It was just a further step in increasing the pressure as we moved closer, cleared away from the cars from the compound, got the debris out of the way, put up the wire. And it was not necessarily going to happen that day. There might be people who went down in the bunkers. It was a day or two. It was increasing the pressure. But I'm sorry, what was your question, sir?
My question was just what kind of, you focused on my word proactive, but were other options, specific options presented to you, or did you just sort of make the decision, well, we're going to increase the pressure and leave it up to the lower, the authorities beneath you as to how to increase that pressure and the specific details of doing that?
The first option was just direct attack, and that was carefully discounted. I thought about, as I told you, the tunnels, if you could tunnel up under and find where the children were and sneak through at night. But they had devices, they had long-range night scopes that could see perhaps where people were, and that would take some time. And frankly, I stopped myself after they described the amount of explosives and the amount of dangerous weapons in there, and just rejected that as exposing an agent's life to danger. I considered,
You considered a lot of options.
4 o'clock in the morning, I would wake up thinking, well, why can't we bring somebody down on a helicopter and come through a roof or something like that? Again, that was exposing agents' lives to dangers, and also people in the compound. We reviewed it to see whether there was any other non-lethal type of substance that could cope with the situation. We went through everything we knew.
One final question on the guns issue. I know you answered my colleague, Mr. Schiff, about my specific proposals, that you wanted to study them. But could you give us a general feeling about the state of the gun laws when somebody like Koresh is able to accumulate the kind of arsenal he did?
Again, I feel very strongly that people shouldn't have weapons in their hands, assault weapons that don't have any sporting purpose. That's something I've always believed. I think we've got to look at this situation where weapons like this can be amassed, where powder like this can be amassed, and understand all that's involved and make the best judgment we can. What I want to do is very carefully consider this and the other circumstances we've seen of mass armament to see what would be the appropriate recommendation.
Thank you. Thank you.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome you here today, General Reno. As a new member of this committee, and I believe the only non-lawyer on the committee, I may take a little different approach than some of my esteemed colleagues, so if you'll just bear with me for a second. First of all, I want to tell you and everyone that's listening that I have great respect for the FBI and also for the ATF, and great respect for the job that you've done since you've come on board. I can't say enough positive things about the quality of the way you've handled answering some tough questions to a very tough situation. I think it would be an understatement that I do take exception with the comments of the gentleman from Michigan, and while I certainly respect his rights to his views, his criticisms directly toward you, even to the point of suggesting that you resign, I personally disagree with that. I'm a little perplexed, however, that at the same time he suggested that he wholeheartedly supported the President's position on this issue. There seems to be somewhat of a contradiction, and that's what prompts me to ask the question, are you satisfied, General Reno, that the President of the United States was fully briefed and he had his eyes wide open when he gave you the go-ahead, if he indeed did give you the go-ahead, as I understand that he did? Do you understand my concern for the conflict? either the President wasn't briefed, misunderstood, didn't care, whatever, and I don't know that that's the case.
I think his eyes were wide open. My understanding, and I don't know, you would have to talk to Mr. Gerson about this, but as acting Attorney General, one of the things that he told me is make sure the President is fully advised, because he had had an experience in Arkansas. And so when I talked to the President, I said, I want to make sure, and he said, that's fine, and we discussed it, and he supported the effort, and I think he knew exactly what I was doing. I don't have any question about that, and I think he fully supported it, and I think he supported it in an informed manner.
Well, unlike, I think it was Mr. Geekus that said that he was watching the television show the evening when I know you were very tired. It was about 11:30. I didn't fall asleep like Mr. Geekus, so I did follow the whole show. With all due respect, it did appear that you made a tremendous effort to insulate the President, as is the job of, I think, the leaders at your level. To the point of talking about the buck ends here, I think you probably said that more than once, and I respect you for that. Harry Truman once said the buck ends at another desk, and while I respect the fact that you were trying to insulate the President, I do think that it's important that the President delegates to his capable people responsibility, but still ultimately takes the responsibility for those actions.
Congressman, if I can just say something there. My mother always taught me that when you make a decision, no matter who else is involved, you've got to be responsible for it. And I can't take, I'm not going to point fingers at the President of the United States or anybody else, because he can take responsibility just as he did. But that doesn't mean that I should duck it. And obviously, this was a decision that I wished I'd never had to make. It's the toughest decision I've ever made. And I think I owe the American people the knowledge that I assume responsibility for it. I wasn't trying to shield the President. And one of the things that was the nicest about it is when I got back from that round of television, I don't think I have ever been so, and perhaps lonely is the word. It was about 12:20 at night. First call I got was from my sister. That a girl. Second call I got was from the President of the United States. That a girl.
Well, there are a lot of people that was saying that a girl to you, and we continue to say that, Attorney General Reno. I would just like to follow up on my good friend and subcommittee Chairman Ron Mazzoli's comment about your position in filling the commissioner of the INS as quickly as possible, and I appreciate your commitment to that as a top priority. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. John Bryant, gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Reno, I believe that the decision that you made, based on the facts that you were given, was justified. And I think any alternative decision you would have been equally fraught with danger, and I regret that the outcome was unforeseeable in these circumstances. I'd like to ask, did the listening devices that the FBI had in the compound indicate what the cult's strategy would have been or was, what their plan was in the event the compound was to be assaulted or in any way advanced upon by the FBI?
Congressman, would you permit me respectfully to say no comment?
Will we learn the answer to that question in the future?
Yes, sir. I don't know the just let me not comment.
Very well.
But let the appropriate legal course take its course, and understand that to the extent we can under the law, we will provide complete and full information.
Well, I take it that the information that you do have in that regard would not have caused you to make any different decision.
That's correct.
I was troubled during the course of this crisis about the many ad hoc statements being attributed by the press to FBI personnel, perhaps to ATF personnel as well. And I'm curious to know what the policy is in the Justice Department regarding people presuming to be spokesmen or sources of information for press reports. One of the earlier reports was that the FBI wanted to go in, but Washington won't let us. Do you know who made that statement?
never heard that statement and don't know who it was, but...
You did not read it?
No, sir.
It was published. I read it. Would it have been appropriate, or that is approved, for an FBI agent to have said that? Would it be inconsistent with policy for an FBI agent to be making those statements?
Again, you would have to talk to the director about the policy of the FBI. I want people to be frank and open, but during a pending matter of this sensitivity, I think such discussion should not take place.
Well, one of the early reports as well was that the Waco newspaper was to blame for the tipping off of the people in the compound prior to the attack on the compound, or the attempt by the ATF to carry out their arrest warrants. Would that kind of a statement have been consistent with departmental policy?
No, sir.
Do you know who made that
Again,
statement?
let me hasten to point out to you in terms of departmental policy, because as I indicated previously in response to a question, I'm waiting for my Deputy Attorney General to get confirmed before we try to spell out policy issues on a number of issues. But in terms of trying to respond, that for what my personal policy is, that would not be consistent with my personal policy to blame the newspaper.
Well, I suppose, and it's not only the content of the comment, but the type of comment. It occurs to me it would be much better in the long run for the image of the agency as well as the department if people were asked to let the department, the director of the FBI, be the spokesman or some designated person, rather than a whole variety of comments attributed to a whole variety of unknown sources. Is that the policy?
My policy is you don't comment on pending investigations.
I hope you will enforce that policy, whether it's with the FBI or the U.S. attorneys or any other part of the Justice Department. It has not been enforced in the past, regrettably.
Let me tell you, and the press from Miami can confirm that my standard comment about pending investigations is no comment. Inevitably, there is a balancing act. We're talking about a pending matter now. I'm trying my best to address issues that don't comment on pending cases. It is a delicate balance, but I think in terms of gratuitous comments that don't go to the issue of providing public information to the public, that we shouldn't be commenting on pending investigations, and we shouldn't be commenting on prosecutions outside the courtroom except to furnish the public information that is public and that they have a right to know.
Well, consistent with that policy, would it have been permissible for one of the agents to come out and say that he had walked around the scene of the fire and found 3 persons that had apparently been shot with a pistol prior to the fire?
One of the things that we were trying to do was to let people know that the major question was whether there was anybody who had survived or what the circumstances were. And we were trying, and it was a delicate balance again, to make the most appropriate comments we could consistent with the facts that we had. That didn't in any way, and we tried to work with the criminal division closely to make sure that we didn't in any way conflict with the pending prosecution and the pending investigation.
My point is that each of these comments, the suggestions with regard to child abuse, which appear to be at least subject to question right now, it's not clear to me what the facts are. The comments with regard to the fact that there were bodies in the fire that had been shot, the comments with regard to the Waco newspaper having been to blame, each time these comments appear to be designed to create a public opinion that is supportive of actions that have already been taken by the agency, whether it's the ATF, the FBI, or the Justice Department. And each time they were, at least for a period of time, called into question. And maybe some of them now will be true, maybe not. I think it's very, very unproductive for this to be taking place. I hope that you will enforce that policy and instruct them in the future to let a designated spokesman tell the public what's going on.
We are trying our best in very difficult circumstances, and we're going to continue to try our best because I share that concern with you. I think it's important in the aftermath of all of this that we try our best to go through it very, very carefully and present as full and informed information to the public as possible, consistent with the pending matter.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. The gentleman from Florida. Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Reno, it's good to see you here today. I can say from past working with you as a member of the Florida legislature when you were representing the state attorneys in Florida, that I'm pleased with your comments today and the strength of your character and in your integrity, which is shown in your testimony here today, as well as your conduct, I think has been demonstrated to the nation, and that's demonstrated something that the people of Florida have known for a long time. So I'm very pleased to ask you just a few questions now. I want to focus on the plan of action that was presented to you by the FBI for injecting the CS gas into the compound, and specifically ask you what contingencies were anticipated, what particular responses were anticipated by those within the compound, and how those particular contingencies were going to be dealt with by the FBI.
One of the first contingencies was that they would fire and that they would shoot at the agents. And so obviously the agents, as the vehicle designed to insert the gas, were the CEV vehicles that were fairly contained, and the head of the hostage rescue team and the FBI can give you the details on that. The Bradley vehicles had a more exposed port, and there was a danger through ricochet or a well-aimed shot that could the agents in those vehicles' lives could be exposed to danger, so that they were somewhat more withdrawn. But one of the contingencies that I said, what happens if they shoot, I mean, I considered the .50 caliber. I said, what if they shoot the .50 caliber at the CEV? CEV can stand it. What if the explosives are set off? What if they dump hand grenades out at the CEV? It can withstand it. And we went through that in great detail because I didn't want the agents' lives exposed to danger. And each time I raised a question, what about this, what about that? They said that the CEV could withstand that. And then the question came, and I asked it, what happens if you suddenly see them in the tower putting children up against the tower and saying, you come any further or you put any more gas in? And they said, well, we would try to pick our snipers are good enough to pick off the people who are holding the children. And I said, no, 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 no. What if they just have the children, if they can influence the children and they're back in the tower? And at that point, I gave specific directions, very specific directions, that they were, at that point, to withdraw immediately, that they were not to expose the children's lives to danger. And they said, you know, what do we do then? I said, we pull back and we just figure out what to do next. The contingent, and I was the one that asked it. I said, what about the worst case scenario if he sets off the explosion, the explosives, or if they get set off accidentally? And we, at that point, the feeling was with the powder there that there would be terrible loss of life. And I said, we have got to make sure we've got every emergency vehicle in case that might possibly happen, and that was something, you know, that we had to consider. One of the eventualities, because listening to the commander of the Delta Force, the commanders past and present, and the head of the, and all the people who had had experience with gas, there were views that if they had gas masks and if they had clothing on that could cover most of their skin, it might be 8 hours before they would want to come out, that some might stay a day or two if they could get into a bunker or someplace. We didn't have, but our feeling was that more would have come out than came out that morning. During the course of the morning, I saw, we knew the wind was high. You could see the way the flags were flying, that it was a heavy wind. And then when I saw the curtain on what I guess is the northwest corner, at any rate one corner, the curtain was almost at right angles, I became concerned because the wind seemed so strong. And I think, but they would have to, the HRT would have to comment on whether the force of the wind might have diminished the impact of the gas. But the feeling was that they would start to come out.
Do you know how many people actually came out before the fire started? Did any?
I think most of the people came out as the fire started. They can give you the precise timing on when the people were located. One got out and then hid in an area near that tall tank, but they can give you the precise chronology.
Let me ask you, General Reno, something about the HRT, and I realize you don't hold yourself out as an expert on the HRT, but if you could tell us what are the specific skills and capabilities which you understand were possessed by the HRT which would not be possessed by an FBI SWAT team or some other similar team?
That's a good question. I was told their marksmanship, their abilities with night sighting, and their abilities to control perimeters, to understand with their technology was superior. I questioned, I probed on it. Their responses seemed to satisfy me satisfied me that there was a difference in the type of security. That's a decision, frankly, that I deferred to them on because I don't profess to be an expert in tactical law enforcement, and I would refer you to the Bureau on that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sangmeister, gentleman from Illinois.
Glad you remembered. Welcome, General Reno, to the Judiciary Committee. I realize you've been sitting there now for over 3 hours, so we'll try to make merciful on you. But there's a couple questions that I would like to have answered. But first, let me say that I generally support everything that you did. If there was maybe one mistake that you did make in this whole proceeding, and that is when you offered yourself to resign from the office for the decision that you had made. I think that's being overly generous, and I think you're overly defensive. Until someone has stood in the shoes that you are in and had to make that decision, they should not be that critical. And I apologize in some respects for the remarks of our colleague. One of the things that has not been talked about too much here, and I suppose if that's under investigation, you don't want to talk about it either, but there are apparently, as we understand the facts, that there would have been no incident at all had the Bureau been able to get in with the search warrant with the element of surprise. And we're talking about the tip-off and that. Is that something that you can comment on, or is that something that's under investigation? And if it is under investigation, is Mr. Higgins working on that, or are you independently working on? Because that seems to be, if that would not have happened, none of this would have happened.
I think that that will be a part of the overall review, but I would refer that to Mr. Higgins, and I want to make sure that I don't comment on anything that would relate to the pending investigation.
Okay. From our constituents and other people, the members of the Congress that knew about this hearing, there's been a lot of rumors about what happened. And again, maybe this should not be directed to you, but I'll ask you if you know anything about it. There's a rumor out there that local law enforcement knew fully what the situation was. In fact, had been in the compound, seen the stash of weapons that were there, evaluated whether they were illegal or illegal, in fact, maybe even confiscated them and returned them to Mr. Koresh. Do you know anything about that at all?
No, I don't. I'd have to refer you to ATF on that.
Okay. Mr. Frank discussed with you all the different options that you went through, and you've been discussing them all morning here. One that is discussed that a lot of people think that you could have done, and I'd like your comments on that, is why not just put barbed wire all around this complex? We have a picture of it here that's been furnished, and in that picture it is wide open all around it. Why didn't you just circle the whole area with barbed wire and put a couple individuals on each end of the compound? I know it's still expensive, but as you've indicated, money was not an object here. Was there any thought about that, and just wait this thing out? If it took a year, wait it out. You've got children involved. How do you answer that?
I can tell you that I ask that regularly. Why not a big concrete fence? Why not good barbed wire, rolls of it? What could we do? The point again was that the Bureau kept advising me that the weaponry they had could fire 3,000 yards, and to post anyone within sufficient distance to properly control the perimeter in a situation like that would not render the area secure, would permit these people to leave if they wanted to and escape law enforcement, and would also render the surrounding area and people coming into the area dangerous because they had apparently had sightseers. I specifically asked that because I kept thinking we could just create our own prison, and the FBI did not feel that it would be secure.
Okay, we accept that answer, and I think it's probably justified under what you, but when you look at the area out there, of course, 3,000 yards is a long way. I've been told there are these type of cults all throughout the United States, and that this may be opening up Pandora's box as to how we're going to control these things. There are many people who would say, you know, these are all religious fanatics. The First Amendment, they've got the right to worship as they see fit, and that we should not be getting involved at all into this area. Do you have any thoughts about that as to where we are proceeding?
I think if a person has or a group has not violated the law, that we certainly shouldn't get involved. And I think that we should take a measured response based on the evidence in the law when we have evidence that they violated the law, and take appropriate precaution, number one, to effect a prosecution, and to effect, to the extent humanly possible, based on the seriousness of the case, an appropriate response to secure their apprehension.
Well, obviously you're referring to the cache of arms that was there, but you know, there's a number of people that will tell you in this country there are a number of enough NRA advocates that would tell you that you can go into a lot of people's homes and find caches of arms that are very close to what you found here, and wonder whether or not that should be the deciding factor as to whether we should go into these compounds. But that's all I have, and I'll yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sangmaster. And the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bob Goodlatte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Reno, I also welcome you here, and I, too, applaud your willingness to come and answer our questions, and also your forthrightness from the outset, from the very beginning, in being willing to stand up and take responsibility for your decisions. And I think most of us here understand that there's a big difference between taking responsibilities for reasonable decisions and the ultimate blame for the outcome in this matter, which is clearly resting at the hands of Mr. Koresh and his immediate circle of people who made outrageous, unsensible decisions from the outset. I'm concerned about the fact that this type of situation could definitely occur again, and that some of the things that were done in the process do raise some questions. I wonder if you have some views on the relationship between the various law enforcement agencies involved here, and whether or not the questions that were raised by the gentleman from Michigan, whose assessment of the situation I do not agree with, but I think who has raised an interesting point that's been commented by others, and that is, could this be handled more effectively? Was there any disability on the part of the FBI, for example, in having to take over in the middle of the situation caused by having the jurisdiction over these two agencies being in different departments of the government?
One of the things that I've stressed is that I really can't comment on what led up to it, because it was a different department and it would be presumptuous of me to comment. Let me just discuss historically my experience after 15 years in Dade County, and I shared this with the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I abhor turf wars and problems that develop in law enforcement because of lack of coordination. And I pride myself on those 15 years, for the most part, just having excellent working relationships with all law enforcement agencies, trying to avoid those conflicts. I'm also concerned about duplication of effort in a time of extraordinarily limited resources at every level of government. And so what I'm committed to trying to do with every fiber in me is develop a real partnership between everybody concerned, state, federal, local law enforcement, that avoids duplication, that ensures coordination, and that basically says there's too much to be done for us to worry about turf wars, and each of us can play a role if we work together effectively on it.
Have you spoken with Secretary Benson regarding that very matter?
Yes, and that's one of the things that we would like to address as part of the overall effort, as to how we can ensure the most effective coordination possible of law enforcement efforts on the part of the United States government.
Given the overlap of criminal activities on the part of people who may violate ATF laws and may violate other laws covered by the FBI or the Immigration Service and others. Do you have an opinion that these agencies should be consolidated in the Department of Justice, and specifically should ATF be there?
I used to sit off in Miami and look at the federal government and wonder about the multiplicity of agencies, and I'm not talking about ATF versus the FBI versus anybody else, and wonder if it couldn't be done better. It would be very presumptuous of me to be the new kid on the block in Washington and suggest to you that I have any particular structure. All I think is that the American people are entitled to the most effective coordination possible of limited resources without duplication that does as much as it possibly can to get to crime in America.
You know if the FBI encountered any difficulties as a result of having to take over in the middle of the situation? Was there a problem with their not being fully briefed on the background? The ATF, after all, had been investigating this gentleman for many, many months before February 28th.
Again, I would defer. I think that ATF worked with us, and it would be better to let the people who are at the scene talk about it. Inevitably, when one agency has been handling something and then another agency takes over, there is a transition.
I'm also very concerned that these type of situations, the element of surprise is absolutely critical. My understanding is that the ATF feels that they needed just 1 minute of surprise to get in there and disarm these people. But it's clear from what happened that the cult members were fully apprised of their imminent arrival, because the estimates are it would have taken them 15 or 20 minutes to set up the welcome that they gave to these agents when they arrived in these cattle trailers. Apparently, every window on the front of this compound was armed with people with semi-automatic weapons. And I wonder if you, in the process of your review of the situation, will include the policy not only of the ATF, which I understand is not under your jurisdiction, but other law enforcement agencies which are, with regard to what kind of communications they have with members of the media and other people in advance. We certainly respect the media and their coverage of these types of events, but secrecy in carrying this out is absolutely important, and inadvertently things happen, and may well have happened in this instance with the fact that the mailman, the letter carrier, apparently having contacts with this cult, even being a member of it possibly, and having contacts with people outside on the road, members of the media possibly, who may have been alerted to this situation and how imminent it was based upon the fact that they were out looking for a story.
The agencies under my jurisdiction are constantly going to be asked to revisit issues, to see what they can learn from problems that have existed in the past. And we've been in the process of doing that, and we will continue to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Jack Reed, gentleman from Rhode Island.
General, I want to commend you for your candor and integrity, not just today, but throughout a very difficult crisis. You were called upon to make some very difficult decisions which many people would shrink from. You didn't. You discharged your duties conscientiously. You were particularly sensitive to the children within that compound, and you showed great fidelity to the laws of this country. As we go forward, I think we all recognize we have to learn from this situation. Now, I have like to focus my inquiry on a specific set of decisions. Once the decision was made to force the issue, then it became a situation of how best to accomplish that tactically.
If you want to make that move.
It appears from your testimony that there was uniform consensus that tear gas would be an effective means of doing that. But I note in your own testimony that the Delta advisors, General Shoemaker and Colonel Boynton, suggested that it be introduced in overwhelming amounts, quickly, rapidly, I would presume to not only upset physically, but to just the shock value of such an event. That recommendation was rejected for a more phased approach, which starting at 6 a.m. in the morning until 12 noon when the fire began, gave 6 hours in which plans could have been hatched to incinerate the compound, or prearranged plans could have been put into effect. In retrospect, and not in a sense to assess any responsibility, but to look forward, could you elaborate on the advice you received from Delta and why that advice was not followed from a more comprehensive approach?
We discussed it at length, and both the head of the hostage rescue team was there, the FBI, and it was a good and frank discussion with Delta Force on what would be the appropriate way to proceed. The more measured approach, again, went to the fact that we hoped that they would not panic and that they would come out in an orderly way, and that's what precipitated our decision. Ironically, once they fired, the FBI did not return the fire, but the FBI then began to insert the gas almost immediately. And so, in effect, Delta Force's recommendation was carried out. Again, and the Bureau will have to go into the details of it and what they've been able to find, but I think that wind had an effect in just blowing it through so that it reduced the impact that we had anticipated.
Let me ask another question, General. Given the uniform belief that Koresh would not surrender, was there, as part of this plan, or at least discussions, physically entering the compound with agents to disarm and arrest or evacuate the people inside?
I gave some thought to just putting everybody in a tank and sending them in, and felt that just to go roaring in, you'd still expose the children's lives to danger possibly. You would have a horrible crossfire in the middle of the building. One of the things that I kept grappling with was, what do we do in this situation? I mean, how do we get the children out? What can we do if there is some kind of an emergency? And it was one of the more difficult issues that I had to grapple with, because I could not see a way to get those children out without exposing the agents' lives to terrible danger.
Again, in retrospect, and this has been asked before, but you seem from your responses to be comfortable with the decision to use an incremental approach and to hope that reason would prevail over the lack of reason, and I still presume you feel that same way.
The only, again, as I explore everything that we have done to date, is what we need to do is talk with people to see if there are other behavioral scientists, religious experts, or somebody else. And it's going to be interesting and important for us, because we may be able to develop an understanding of what expertise was specifically necessary to deal with Koresh, though we will never know. The next time it may be a different cult and a different cult and a different cult where there's another approach. So it may be that we've got to develop a cadre of different types of applied human science. I just, at this point, don't know the answer. I know that we struggled with it in the hindsight of the last 10 days or so. Nobody has given me an alternative if I didn't know what was going to happen that would have really addressed the problem.
Thank you, General, for your testimony and for your service. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reed. And Mr. Robert Scott, gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And General Reno, I appreciate your patience. I just wanted to make a comment first and join in the concern that's kind of been expressed that there seemed to be some question as to whether we had the capability to indefinitely surround this compound because we had only one force. They were getting tired. Mr. Chairman, is that my warning light already? Oh, thank you. That we had, that we did not have the capability of staying around indefinitely, that we were getting tired, and that obviously is a concern. I think I heard you say in response to another question in terms of tipping off the media before you make an arrest. Did I understand you to say that you did not do that in Florida?
I tried I mean, if the media came to me and said, we want to cooperate with you and let us go in, I say, no, that's just not my style. Inevitably, the media would sometimes, through observation and others, find out about it, but I tried to have a policy in my office that the media didn't go along on warrants that our office had anything to do with.
Well, my reaction to that is I appreciate that, because it seems to me that some arrests are made in such a way to inflict embarrassment or to develop media and not to efficiently affect the arrest, and it seems to me that that might have gotten in the way and created the situation we were in. Do you have any information that one law enforcement agency had information that was not available to the ATF?
I don't know. You would really have to talk to the ATF about that.
Well, and I get that response, because of that response, I want to associate myself with comments that others have made that there may be some value to coordinating all the arrest powers into one agency, because you have two cabinet secretaries. The ATF doesn't report to you at all. They're not in your chain of command.
Not in my chain of command, but again, one of the things I want to be clear, I assume that the U.S. Attorney's Office in Texas was involved in obtaining the warrant.
Well, I think if we had better coordination, perhaps like the FBI makes the arrests in every other agency, when they find laws that have been broken, they refer to the FBI to make the arrest. Perhaps that could be done with the ATF. Let me another area, and that is on the tear gas that was used. What were you told about the? You were told that the tear gas that was used, that was selected, was not lethal. What were you told the effect of the tear gas would be on people?
That their eyes would run, their nose would run, it would be very uncomfortable, they would have tightness in their chest. I specifically asked, does that mean a heart attack, or no, it goes again to tissue, that they would, some people could stand it longer than others, that if they had their gas mask on and clothing covering their hands, they could stand it longer, but that it was a particulate as opposed to a gas, and that it would settle in the room, and then as they walked around the room, it would get stirred up and get in to more commerce of the room, if you will, that as they tried to drink, taking off their gas mask, that would become more uncomfortable. I specifically asked about the issue of permanent harm to anyone, particularly children and particularly infants, and as I indicated previously, went to great lengths to try to talk to the doctor and did talk to the toxicologist to conclude that it would not produce, based on any case study that had been done, permanent harm.
There are statements that have been made in the press that this particular gas that was selected had been banned for military use.
I don't know. I had not heard that. I specifically asked both the Delta commanders and the hostage rescue team if this was, they said that this was the gas that was used, and when they were, apparently I was told that every officer, every soldier in the Army is gassed at least once a year or on a regular basis. It apparently varied from unit to unit, but I don't know any of the circumstances concerning whether it's banned.
After the holes had been poked in the wall, it was your expectation that there would be some time delay in between where they would have the opportunity to assess the situation and hopefully get out before the gas had been released? Is that my understanding?
What happened in that morning as they went through it, they inserted gas for about 2 hours. Then there was an approximate, and they can give you the precise time frames on it, when they pulled back and did not gas and waited and tried to get the people to come out by explaining, come out, walk out the front door, come down the road. Then after that period, and there seemed to be no response of any kind, they proceeded again.
Did they have any way to know whether or not people had panicked because of the reaction to the gas?
They could see movement in the building, and based on what they could see, as I understand it, and they can give you more details, there did not appear to be any sign of panic. And when they came out to pick up the telephone, there did not, the one person did not appear to be panicked.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. And Mr. Hyde, gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Chairman, I have a motion and a request to make, and if I may be recognized for the motion first. I move that all of the members of the committee be permitted to submit questions in writing to the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of the Treasury, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms concerning the events in Waco, and that those questions and responses be made a part of the hearing record, with the understanding that any information that is prosecution sensitive may be exempted.
In other words, after the word writing, you'd be in any other request for information that would not compromise any prosecutions or other law enforcement activities.
That's perfectly acceptable to me.
And without objection, the motion is agreed to, and the gentleman is recognized for another couple of seconds.
Mr. Chairman, I would respectfully request that you, on behalf of the committee, ask the various agencies involved here and to provide the following documents to the committee for inspection by any member of the committee or his or her designee. And again, with the caveat that any of these documents that might compromise a prosecution then pending would be exempted. And here's what I would request: transcripts of communications within the compound obtained through FBI listening devices, transcripts of any phone conversations between individuals within the compound and any other parties during the time period in question, any and all documents relating to conversations or meetings with current or former members of the Davidian organization, the identity, affiliation, and qualifications of all individuals inside or outside of the FBI or the ATF who gave advice, background information, or guidance on how to proceed against the Branch Davidian sect, or strategies and appropriate methods to resolve the standoff, including but not limited to behavioral scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, psycholinguists, trained theologians, cult specialists, and other specially trained persons or military personnel. Any information on child abuse, including specific dates, times, and locations where the abuse is said to have occurred, witnesses to the conduct and the nature of the abuse, and existing guidelines or policies, if any, for the Department of Justice, the Department of the Treasury, the FBI, or the ATF on media presence at the execution of a warrant or other law enforcement actions. Mr. Chairman, it's my hope that you would request that as an official request on behalf of the committee, that you would provide a repository for this information and make it accessible at reasonable times to all members or their designees, again exempting anything that might compromise a prosecution. I think that would provide us with a fuller and dare I say, more relaxed opportunity to learn what happened other than this tension-filled morning we've gone through. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I would recognize now Mr. Javier Becerra from California. Gentlemen, if you have any questions, we wanted to recognize you. Appreciate your being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Madam General, for being here. Before I ask, I have only one question. Before I do ask the question, I just would like to say that I'm very pleased to hear many of your remarks and your explanations for some of the questions that have been posed to you. Obviously, any time that a situation occurs, it is important for those of us who are in government to have an opportunity to explain it to our constituents very well. And it's important for you to be here. Whether it's Waco, Texas, or Wounded Knee, I think government must be accountable to the people, and we must be able to explain what went on. The only question I would ask you, given that there were so many questions already asked, is given your strong support for preventative approaches to resolving problems, and I'm very pleased in the chances that I've had to discuss this with you, that you seem to focus so much on prevention versus trying to remediate a problem. What do you think that we will glean from this that will help in terms of preventing a situation like this from occurring? And perhaps you can expand a bit on what your philosophy is with regard to prevention of this type of criminal activity.
Well, having been in situations where I've never met a person who was a victim of a crime that wouldn't have rather have had it prevented, I've gotten in the habit over the last 15 years of looking at prevention and what could be done. And I think my meeting with Congressman Hughes was a good first step in trying to explore what we can do with respect to cults where children are involved to address the issue of child abuse. and the problems associated with that. In abuse in all its forms, because some of the information that comes back to us is that after a child is in a cult situation for any length of time, there may be a permanent damage to that person. We've got to work through it, understand it. The mysteries of the human mind in all sorts of forensic issues have been one of the great puzzles of the last 10 years as we learn more about it. And what I want to do is, again, try to talk to every expert that we can through the processes that we will develop, we develop, to make sure that we have as much information as we can.
Your response raises another question in my mind. Do we know how many of the individuals were, say, perhaps beyond the age of 40 in the compound?
The FBI may have the information. I'm sorry, Congressman, I don't.
It seems that most of the individuals were either of a younger age or what might be considered young adults and not yet past a particular age, 40 or so. And I don't know if it's worth examining, but it seems to me along the lines of what you just said that there might be something to that, that a lot of minds, young minds, are being influenced in negative ways, and perhaps it is important for us to be there to provide resources to young people, children, at an early stage rather than wait till we find that their minds are polluted with a lot of information that causes things like this to occur.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. And I want to say thank you very much, General. You've been very gracious and sympathetic and long-suffering as we went through this, but we enjoyed having you.
It's been a pleasure.
Hope you come back under more auspicious circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you very much. And the committee will stand adjourned until 2:30, recessed until 2:30, and we'll start with Mr. Higgins, and then we'll have Mr. Sessions. We have questions on the two of them. We'll finish this afternoon. Thank you and goodbye for a while.
You've been watching C-SPAN's live coverage of this House Judiciary Committee hearing. Members have taken a brief recess, and we will be leaving our coverage now in order to fulfill our long-standing commitment to bringing you live gavel-to-gavel coverage of the United States House of Representatives. Please tune to our schedule update tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5